CD 13.
The new normal. By early 1969, Alexander Dubček had outlived his usefulness to Brezhnev, who now looked for an excuse to eject him from his post as Czechoslovak party leader. The opportunity duly presented itself on the 28th of March, when Czechoslovakia played against the USSR for the World Ice Hockey Championship in Stockholm. In a tight match, the Czechoslovaks eked out a 4-3 victory. The team refused to shake hands with their Soviet opponents. Close to 500,000 Czechs rushed into the streets of Prague to exult in the triumph. In Wenceslas Square, someone picked up a cobblestone and smashed the windows of the office of the Soviet airline Aeroflot, which was all the excuse the Russians needed to intervene. The Soviet Defence Minister, Andrei Grechko, rushed to Prague to dress down his Czechoslovak counterpart, claiming that the demonstrations were not spontaneous, but well planned and organised by counter-revolutionary elements. Grechko issued a dark threat. "We warn you, we shall not tolerate a repetition of such acts," he said. "We shall make short shrift even of 100,000 counter-revolutionaries." The loyal Dubček was demoted into oblivion. On the 17th of April, he was forced out of the party leadership and relegated to the position of chairman of the rebranded Federal Assembly. Later in the year, he was named ambassador to Turkey and then dismissed from that post just a few months later. Finally, a clerical position was found for him in the Western Slovak State Forests Department. His former ally, Dr. Gustav Husak, was named the party's first secretary. Gustav Husak was a solid replacement as far as the Soviets were concerned, an ambitious Slovak associated in the public mind with the reformists, who was nonetheless prepared to do Brezhnev's bidding in all things. Under his leadership, Czechoslovakia returned to the fold as one of Moscow's most obedient allies. Physically, Husak was easy to overlook. With his receding hairline of neat, snowy hair, thick glasses, and pleasant, pudgy face, he resembled an academic from a regional university. But his bland exterior concealed a complex and driven personality. Husak, whose childhood had been marked by poverty and deprivation, had joined the communists in the 1930s and was jailed periodically during the war. Like Dubček, he joined the Slovak partisan uprising against Nazi Germany and the puppet Tiso government. After the war, Husak became the effective leader of the Slovak communists, where he showed considerable acumen in crushing the local democratic parties. Husak was quick-witted, hard-working, and seen by his rivals as dangerously capable. Husak could rouse an audience with a good speech, particularly when calling for greater autonomy for Slovakia within the new Socialist Republic. All this marked him out for special treatment from Prague once the purges and the show trials got underway. On the 6th of February 1951, Husak was arrested and denounced as a bourgeois nationalist. Husak was tortured under interrogation, but he steadfastly refused to confess to the accusations put to him by his interrogators. He expected to be dragged to the gallows, like Slansky, but he was sentenced to life imprisonment instead. Once inside, several inmates, who had been put there by Husak, took their revenge upon him, putting a bag over his head and beating him. Husak nonetheless held tight to his ambitions and in his faith that the communist movement would get back on track one day and rehabilitate him. In 1960, 9 years into his sentence, Husak was released by President Novotny as part of his lukewarm, de-Stalinization program. Husak was a free man, but his marriage was in ruins. While he'd been away, his wife Magda had become a successful theatre director and had fallen in love with one of her leading men. Husak's time in jail had hardened, not humanised him. The reformist Zdeněk Mlynář observed he had emerged from his long years of isolation as a powerful political personality, eager to show the knaves and fools the proper way to conduct politics. In 1963, Husak was rehabilitated by the party with the strong support of his fellow Slovak, Alexander Dubček, who saw him as an educated communist and a natural ally. When Husak replaced Dubček as party leader in 1969, he might have entertained hopes that he would be allowed some latitude. But the Soviets made it clear from the outset that he served at their pleasure. His colleague Lubomir Strugel recalled that the phone calls from Brezhnev started coming right away. In his first 8 years as First Secretary, Husak visited Brezhnev 26 times, more than 3 times as often as any other Soviet bloc leader, and he regularly consulted with the Soviet ambassador. For all his cleverness, Husak had become another Emil Haka, a servile cutout for an empire that intended to run Czechoslovakia as a vassal state. A joke circulated in Prague about a man who was eaten whole by Leonid Brezhnev. As he passes into Brezhnev's stomach, he encounters Gustav Husak. "Comrade President," the man calls out, "has Brezhnev eaten you too?" "Oh no," answers Husak, "I came in from the other end." At Brezhnev's urging, Husak initiated a purge of the party membership, beginning at the uppermost levels, then reaching down into every workplace. 1.5 million party members were screened to decide whose membership should be renewed or cancelled. Eventually, more than 300,000 were expelled. Those who had expressed support for Dubček's reforms were invited to sign a declaration renouncing their views, which would then be placed on file. The point of this confession was not to incriminate, but to humiliate, to make people complicit in their own subjugation. Writers, academics, doctors and journalists who refused to recant were put to work as cleaners, stokers, bricklayers and rubbish collectors. Prague soon had the most over-educated menial workforce in the world. Armed guards with automatic weapons policed the border. Escape into Austria or West Germany became a near impossibility. Normalisation was not a return to Stalinist violence. Husak's regime practiced a subtler, wearier form of totalitarianism. There was no need for the direct application of mass terror. Instead, the party entrenched its rule by doling out small luxuries to its supporters: a car, a better apartment, promotion. Rebellion would be met with a sliding scale of counter-incentives: demotion, defamation, relegation to a job in a factory or in a uranium mine. The party no longer seriously expected to win over hearts and minds to the heroic task of building socialism in Czechoslovakia. It was enough to merely nod one's head when apparatchiks said how well everything was going. Dissidents were no longer denounced as heretics, but as troublemakers and hooligans. The state did not require the entire person, wrote one purged party member, just the part that projects above the surface of public life. The purging of independent thought and initiative, however, left the regime with the same problem it had faced in the 1950s: a severe shortage of competent professionals to keep the country running. The newly vacated posts were often filled by politically reliable people of no discernible skill or talent. Czechoslovakia became a kingdom of the mediocre and incompetent, while its most talented and imaginative people cleaned boilers and washed windows. Access to higher education became a useful means to keep people on a short leash. Each year, lists of prospective students were compiled by regional committees who marked the names of kids from politically reliable families with an A. These were to be accepted at once. Those marked with an N were not to be accepted under any circumstances, no matter how well they performed in their exams. Fear of spoiling their children's education led many to just keep their heads down and encourage their sons and daughters to do the same. Parents were thus exposed to their children as liars and hypocrites. Pavel Kohut observed ruefully that children are taught that lying is an ethic. Say one thing at home, another at school. Of course, it's understandable, but it's also our tragedy. I did it for the children, is the Czech problem. Golden Nightingales. The explosion of pop and rock music in the 1960s was an ongoing headache for the regime. Songs performed to a mass audience that called implicitly or explicitly for truth and personal freedom presented problems both for the state and for the people who sang them. The different fortunes of the nation's most popular male and female recording stars, Karel Gott and Marta Kubišová, illustrate the hard choices faced by Prague's creative artists under normalisation. Karel Gott was the uncontested king of Czech Europop, a 5-time winner of the Golden Nightingale Award for the most popular male singer. Gott sang in German as well as Czech, and thus became a star in West Germany and Austria as well. His album and concert sales earned him a stream of foreign royalty payments, much of which was siphoned off by the regime. Karel Gott had emerged in the early 1960s as a kind of Czech Cliff Richard. As the decade wound on, he grew out his hair, put on some flares, and learnt to gyrate. But his songs were apolitical, and his appearance was clean-cut. The regime was unnerved by Gott's popularity, and in 1971 it decided to take him down a peg. Ruda Pravo scolded him as a bad example to the nation's youth. While recording a one-man primetime special for state television, Gott was told by the director to cut his hair. 2 full days of tense negotiations followed between Gott's manager and the Ministry of Culture. Eventually, a compromise was reached. 2 centimetres would have to be shorn off above the ears. He would be allowed to grow it back for his tour of West Germany, but until then, it was decreed, the ears must show. The regime gave him another slap when it banned one of his songs, a ballad of a lover who flips a coin to tell if his girlfriend loves him or not. The song was deemed objectionable for its insulting attitude towards the value of the Czech currency. Gott, who was on tour in West Germany, decided to call the regime's bluff, and he threatened to remain in the West indefinitely. With that, Husak backed down, and he wrote a personal letter pleading with him to return. Dear Karel, we are not angry with you. Please come back to see us, and you will get your contract to sing in the West. But you must sing for us too, and if you agree, we will fulfill your every wish. We want to help you, but isn't it logical that you should help us too? Karel Gott and the regime reached an accommodation that allowed him to keep most of his earnings and live like a rock star in Prague, with the regime's blessing. Marta Kubišová's career took a different path. Young, vampish, and achingly beautiful, Kubishova was the closest thing the Czechs had to Dusty Springfield. Her husky contralto voice filled any space effortlessly, and she invested her songs with genuine feeling. Adored by her fans, Kubishova was voted the winner of the Female Golden Nightingale Award 3 times in the 1960s. When the Soviets invaded, Marta publicly supported the embattled Dubček, dashing up to him on the steps of the Central Committee building to give him a bunch of roses and a medallion of an angel to wear on his wrist. Kubishova's most famous song, A Prayer for Marta, was played throughout the invasion crisis on Czechoslovak radio. Its words were taken from a prayer written by the 17th century Czech exile John Amos Comenius. Let peace remain long within this land. Malice, envy, fear and strife, let them pass. Let them finally pass. The song tapped into a deep longing for peace, freedom and independence. In February 1969, Marta sang it defiantly at the televised Golden Nightingale Awards ceremony. Marta had become a symbol of national resistance and inspiration. That same year, she married the charismatic Czech New Wave film director Jan Nemec, who had shot footage of the anti-Soviet protests in Wenceslas Square. When the Czechs beat the Russians at the Ice Hockey Championships, Nemec became so excited he told Marta he wanted to write her name in bullets above their apartment's bay window. In 1970, Marta won the Golden Nightingale once more by popular vote. But this time, there would be no ceremony. She was told she would have to pick up her award privately at the offices of Young World magazine. Soon afterwards, on the eve of a concert tour, her manager was summoned to the office of the state booking agency Prago Concert, where the agency's director laid out a photo montage from a Danish porn magazine called Hot Kittens. Marta's face had been superimposed onto one of the bodies in the pictures. When Marta saw the pages, she laughed, thinking the forgery was too crude to be believed. Copies of Hot Kittens were nonetheless sent to various media outlets, and Marta was dropped from the booking agency. Determined not to be undone by such a squalid fabrication, she sued the director of Prago Concert for defamation. She won her case, but all her bookings dried up anyway, and she was led to understand that if she was to persist in singing, some other form of fake evidence against her would soon appear in the newly compliant press. Marta became pregnant, but in the aftermath of the stressful court case, she suffered a traumatic miscarriage at 8 months, losing so much blood that the doctors had to revive her from a state of clinical death. Her career abruptly terminated. Marta and her husband retreated to the countryside. Jan Nemec found work as a tractor driver, and she took on a job gluing bags together in a factory. Nemec found the isolation and irrelevance unbearable, and he migrated to West Germany. Marta chose to stay behind, and the couple divorced. Occasionally, she would slip back into Prague and walk the streets. On bad days, she hoped a balcony or a cornice from a decaying building would fall on her and kill her. With her last royalty payment, she bought a washing machine. The ear. 3 apparatchiks came to Prague one month for a party conference. After the first day, they sat up late in their hotel room, drinking and telling stories. The alcohol loosened their tongues a little, and they began to complain about the secret police. One of them hushed the other 2 and whispered, "What if they're listening to us right now?" The other 2 laughed, so the man decided to play a joke. He went downstairs to the hotel reception. He asked the woman at the desk to deliver 3 cups of tea to the room in 15 minutes. When he rejoined his friends, he sat down and leant towards a vase of plastic flowers and said, "Hello, Comrade Major. Could you have 3 cups of tea sent up to our room?" His friends laughed, but when the tea arrived, they blanched, made their excuses and went to bed. The next morning, the man went out for a walk, but when he returned to the hotel, his friends were gone. He asked the receptionist what had happened to them. "They've been arrested," she said. "They would have arrested you too, but the Comrade Major really liked your joke about the tea." The dread that one's conversation might be overheard was the subject of many jokes from this time. Some were long, shaggy dog tales. Others achieved a kind of pithy perfection. An American visits a Czech relative in Prague. "How are things going?" he asks. "Oh, you know," replies the Czech. "Can't complain." The secret police devoted enormous resources to keeping tabs on troublemakers. The dissident writer Ludwig Vatsulik and his wife Madla discovered tiny microphones hidden in every room in their apartment. Their phone was bugged, and another apartment in their block was taken over by STB agents to monitor their conversations. Thus, for 20 years, they avoided discussing anything of significance out loud and wrote it down instead on flushable sheets of toilet paper. In 1970, a tense psychological drama called The Ear was released from Barrandov Studios. The movie was centred around a couple, Ludwig and Anna, who return home drunk after a glittering cocktail party for senior officials. The handsome Ludwig, a deputy minister, discovers his house keys have gone missing. So he climbs the garden wall to get in, but they find the front door is unlocked. Just as worryingly, the phone is dead and the power is out, even though the lights are on in the other houses in the street. Then they spot trench-coated secret police officers prowling outside. The couple snipe and bicker. Ludwig has learned at the reception that his boss, who is Jewish, has been mysteriously detained. Ludwig and Anna anxiously go over the earlier conversations from the evening, agonising over whether Ludwig has said or done something wrong. They discover more evidence the house has been searched. In a panic, Ludwig rifles through his documents and flushes a torn-up photo of him with his former boss down the toilet. Their fighting is abruptly halted when Anna finds a listening device in the kitchen. More bugs are found in every room of the house. Anna's fury at her husband turns to fear as the couple realise their conversations have been monitored electronically all night by what she calls the ear. Ludwig locks himself in the bathroom, intending to kill himself. But he discovers his revolver has already been confiscated by the secret police. When they want to do it, they do it themselves, he mutters. At 5 a.m, the phone rings. It's the president, offering congratulations. Ludwig is to replace his former boss. Through the ear, the police have heard proof of his cowardice and are satisfied he'll give the regime no trouble. The Ear was directed by Karel Kahina from a screenplay he co-wrote with Jan Prohaska, one of Prague's most outspoken writers and intellectuals. Prohaska had once been an ardent communist, but had since fallen out with the party. His outspokenness had brought him to the attention of no less a figure than the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Convinced that Prohaska was part of an elite anti-state group, the KGB had sent an agent posing as a West German tourist to befriend Prohaska and then abduct him into East Germany. The plot had to be aborted, and the agent realised that Prohaska spoke no Russian and he spoke no Czech. After the Soviet invasion, Prohaska continued to pen attacks on the regime, but then the chill of normalisation set in. His health declined. Prohaska was wondering if the authorities would ever let him work again when he saw a TV guide mentioning that a documentary was to be broadcast on state TV about him, titled Report from on the Seine. Prohaska was pleased and relieved. He saw it as an olive branch from the party, a gesture of respect towards an honourable critic of the regime. When the program began, Prohaska and his family were confused by what they saw. On the screen, there was a view of rolling countryside seen through the front window of a car. The driver was not visible, but his hands were on the wheel, and he could be heard talking to a companion who was also out of sight. The driver laughed and said terrible, insulting things about Alexander Dubček and various members of Prague's literary community. Prohaska was confused until he realised, with horror, that the driver's voice was his own. Somehow, the secret police had recorded a late-night conversation where he and a friend had indulged in the classic vice of writers everywhere, drinking too much and bad-mouthing their fellow authors. The STB had simply dubbed the audio over some driving footage to make Prohaska look like a snide elitist, dumping on his friends while cruising around France. The phone rang in his apartment. The caller denounced him as a monstrous, shameless, two-faced bastard. Report from on the Seine instantly destroyed Prohaska's reputation. He was snubbed by the people he'd criticised on the tape. The broader public seemed to enjoy seeing a hypocritical writer knocked off his perch. Prohaska tried to redeem his reputation, typing letter after letter to explain how the STB had edited the conversation out of context to make it sound so much worse than it was. But his former friends continued to shun him, despite his rapidly declining health. Prohaska was then diagnosed with bowel cancer, but his wife chose not to tell him, seeing as he had not long to live. Jan Prohaska died in February 1971 at the age of 42. And the film he wrote, The Ear, was buried in the archives. It's hard to overstate the sheer weirdness of normalisation. Amid the dullness, there was a through-the-looking-glass quality to daily life in which people were expected to accept 6 impossible things before breakfast. The terrible dinginess, the shortages, the suppression of honest opinion were at odds with Husak's claim that life was getting better and sweeter. Communism seemed both unsustainable and unkillable. In 2018, on a long 4-hour flight from Perth to Sydney, I fell into conversation with the woman next to me, Anna, who had grown up in communist Poland. I asked her if she'd ever travelled to Czechoslovakia during those years, and she recalled spending a summer at a friendship camp in Spičák near the German border with a group of other kids from the Soviet bloc. One day, Anna said, the camp administrator informed them that an important party dignitary would be visiting to make a speech. They would have to make the camp look nice for the official photographs. But there was a problem, Anna explained. The lawn in front of the hostel had dried out, so all of us were given buckets of green paint to make it look good for the cameras. You painted the lawn green? I asked. We painted the lawn green. With brushes or rollers? With brushes, she said. So what happened when the party dignitaries came? Well, they came, they made their speeches, of course, the happy photos were taken, and after they left, the lawn completely died. I had to ask if the news pictures of the event were published in colour or black and white. "Oh, black and white," she said, smiling. Boney. In May 1975, Gustav Husak replaced the ageing Svoboda as president, while retaining his post as party leader. From his high perch at Prague Castle, Husak looked down at a city frozen in time. The Old Town, New Town, and Mala Strana had become precincts of flaking facades and rotting interiors, propping each other up in their old age. The wandering, tendril-like streets and the cluttered skyline of domes, towers and spires seemed so strangely at odds with the communist ideal of an orderly, centrally planned society. Prague's housing crisis was solved by the construction of estates of prefabricated tower blocks on the city's periphery. These apartment buildings, known as panelaki, were heroic in scale and close to tram and metro stations, but the towers were ugly, and the tower parks barren and depressing. Public areas lacked the laneways, street shops, huddled cafes and public gardens, where friends and neighbours might just run into each other and socialise. The powerful social solidarity that had bound Praguers together after the invasion atomised under the pressure of normalisation, as people concluded that political activity was either too dangerous or simply pointless. The STB compiled secret reports acknowledging a deep passivity pervading the people of Prague. Unable to escape state supervision, they practiced a kind of inner migration and retreated into their private lives, finding satisfaction within their families or in the pursuit of good beer, pork, dumplings and cabbage. Praguers in these years lived for the weekend, finishing work early on Fridays to head for their country cottages, where they could drop their guard and enjoy their work, mowing the lawns, planting and harvesting vegetables from the garden, mending and extending their houses. All adults were required to work during the week, but few were motivated to perform beyond the minimum requirements of the planned economy. Alcoholism was endemic, and working conditions were often dangerous and unhealthy. Power generation relied on burning brown coal, which often smothered Prague in sulphurous smog. Nearby forests began to die off at an alarming rate, and many waterways became sewers of pollution. Low-grade food could be produced in sizable quantities on the collective farms, but poor distribution meant that much of it would rot before it reached the shelves. People lined up outside shops to buy Cuban oranges, Hungarian shampoo, or Moravian sausages, often joining a line without knowing what was on sale. Milk was often sold in plastic sacks that often burst inside shopping bags. Women's sanitary napkins had to be washed and reused. Toilet paper was almost never available, so people improvised by using pages of Ruda Pravo. Manufactured goods such as cars and refrigerators were poorly constructed and spare parts almost non-existent. Electricians, plumbers and car mechanics conducted freelance work illegally after hours, which earned them more money than their regular jobs with state-owned enterprises. When television began broadcasting in colour, it hardly mattered, as almost no one owned a colour TV set to watch it on. But within this sea of austerity, there were a few tiny islands of plenty. Western goods of all kinds could be bought at a chain of special state-run stores called Tuzeks shops, but only with special vouchers purchased with Western hard currency that was nicknamed Boney, taken from the word for coupons. Czech citizens were permitted to receive limited gifts foreign currency from relatives living in the West. These dollars and Deutschmarks could in turn be exchanged for boni, giving ordinary people entry into Tuzex's cornucopia of French cognac, Brazilian coffee, Marlboro cigarettes, Sony TV sets and Casio watches. Inevitably, the Tuzex stores became a focal point for organised crime. Gangs of hustlers, known as Wechslacks, would hang around banks and hotel lobbies, offering to illegally exchange foreign currency for Czech crowns at a far better rate than offered by the authorities. Flush with Western currency, the hustlers could exchange their cash for Tuzex vouchers, which they could then sell to citizens for Czech crowns at inflated rates. Ideological communists deplored the brand fetishism that turned Levi's jeans into haute couture and made Coca-Cola a delicacy to be enjoyed at Christmas time. But the regime badly needed the hard currency that came into the Tuzex stores, so they looked the other way when the grey market blended into the black. The secret streamlet. Prague's bohemians spent the early 1970s finding solace in private parties, cheap beer and adultery. For me, Václav Havel later confessed, the first half of the decade is a single, shapeless fog. Each of us, in his own way, was stewing in his own juices. Unable to stage plays or publish books or participate meaningfully in their own society, they killed time in bars, bedrooms and country houses, sleeping with each other's spouses. Tired of the intrigue and the insularity of Prague, Havel and Olga spent more and more time at Hradeček, their cottage in the mountains. He was still writing, but with no hope that his plays would be performed in his own country. In 1974, Havel took a labouring job at the Trutnov brewery, 10 kilometres from Hradeček. He found the work calming and satisfying, and after a few months, he was ready to step back into public life. It was time, he realised, to stop reacting to whatever the state wanted to dish out to him. Instead, he would give them something to react to, which took the form of a long, open letter to the nation's leader. Havel's Letter to Dr. Husak addressed itself to the malaise of Czechoslovak society under normalisation, but it stands for all time as a classic essay on the practical and moral consequences of totalitarianism. Havel contrasted the apparently placid surface of everyday life in Czechoslovakia with the pervasive sense of fear lurking underneath. This was not, he wrote, a quaking in terror kind of fear, but a constant awareness of danger that might be hovering nearby or in the distance. A fear that drove people to express support for the party's decisions, enforced, in the last resort, by the secret police, which he likened to a hideous spider, whose invisible web runs right through the whole of society. But, Havel noted, the party itself would become paralysed by its own venom and fail to function properly. In a remarkably prescient passage, Václav Havel foresaw the circumstances of the regime's downfall. He wrote, "A secret streamlet trickles on beneath the heavy lid of inertia and pseudo-events, slowly and inconspicuously undercutting it. It may be a long process, but one day it must happen. The lid will no longer hold and will start to crack. This is the moment when once more something visibly begins to happen, something truly new and unique, something unscheduled in the official calendar of happenings, something that makes us no longer indifferent to what occurs and when, something truly historic in the sense that history again demands to be heard. White light, white heat. Paul Wilson was unwilling to give up on Prague while there was still so much going on in the city. In late 1969, Paul was introduced in the street to Ivan Yurus, an art critic with long curly chestnut hair and a forceful gaze. Yurus invited Paul to come over to his apartment for potato dumplings and beer. At the apartment, Paul met two members of a new psychedelic band called the Plastic People of the Universe. The group, founded by 4 teenagers from Prague's Brevnov district, were heavily influenced by the New York band The Velvet Underground and had somehow procured a copy of the Velvet's classic first album with an Andy Warhol banana on the cover. Somehow the numbness of normalisation had failed to penetrate this room. While Yurus cooked, the guests helped themselves to jugs of Pilsner as their host held forth on Czech history and culture, in between flipping records by the Velvet Underground, The Doors and Captain Beefheart on his crude stereo. Yurus, Paul discovered, was argumentative and pugnacious. He had arrived at a set of ideas that guided his life, and he protected them with all the zeal of an ideologue. There was always a sense, Paul felt, that the argument might end up in blows, although it never did. Paul Wilson and Ivan Yurus became part of a merry, free-floating association of artists, musicians and hangers-on who called themselves the Crusader School of Pure Humour Without Jokes. In a parody of communist bureaucracy, Yurus styled himself as the group's Minister of the Interior and vetted the membership carefully. He assumed the nickname Magor, which translates as fool or fantasist, taken from the Czech word phantasmagoria. Ivan Yurus was excited by the primitive, confrontational power of the Plastic People of the Universe, and he had become the band's artistic director, just as Andy Warhol had for the Velvet Underground. He invited Paul to come and see them perform in a village pub just north of Prague. Paul entered the dance hall and saw an audience of long-haired rock and roll fans jostling and smoking and drinking. The Plastic People hit the stage at sundown, wearing dirty, long satin gowns and sinister makeup. Fires burnt on either side of the stage. When the band broke into their opening song, a juddering cover of the Velvet Underground's White Light, White Heat, the crowd began to dance frantically. A fire breather leapt into the dance floor and shot a blast of flame from his mouth, while the singer did his best to mimic Lou Reed. The music was crude, bacchanalian, thrilling. Yurus asked Paul what he thought. Paul said he thought they were wonderful, but needed to practice more. "Oh, have you any idea, man," Yurus groaned, "just how difficult it is to get gigs right now?" The regime's cultural apparatchiks were straining to keep rock and roll within the bounds of cheerful, acceptable pop. But the Plastics had chewed through the leash. Karel Gott, with his helmet of sculpted hair, was welcome. Shaggy teenagers making a distorted racket in live shows that were literally inflammatory were not. The Plastics' early repertoire was made up almost entirely of cover versions of songs by the Velvet Underground and the Fugs, sung in English, even though the band didn't really understand the lyrics. They turned to Paul for help, and he joined the group as singer and rhythm guitarist. To perform in public, bands were required by law to audition for a licence. At the end of the Plastics audition, a disgusted official said, "Cut their hair and send them down the mines." The Plastics were denied professional status, which was quite acceptable to Ivan Yurus, who thought the very concept of state-sanctioned rock music was ludicrous anyway. Unable to find a venue, Yurus circumvented the rules by organising public lectures on pop art, where he would talk about Andy Warhol, and then the Plastics would perform songs from the Velvet Underground to illustrate the point. Eurus was paid an honorarium for these lectures, which he used to buy instruments for the band. But it wasn't long before the STB figured out this ruse. Eurus was interrogated and accused of earning money illegally. While Eurus tried to ignore the authorities, sometimes he was unable to help himself. In the summer of 1973, he was jailed for insulting a retired STB officer by eating a page from Rue de Pravo in front of him, telling him the Bolsheviks were destined to be devoured the same way. For that, he was sentenced to 10 months in prison. Paul Wilson left the Plastics on friendly terms in late 1972, as the band's repertoire began to fill up with original songs sung in Czech. Their sound matured when saxophonist Vratislav Brabenec joined and introduced jazz tonalities to their music. They dropped the props, the robes, the makeup, the fire, and moved towards a stripped-back, more authentic presence on stage. They joined forces with a legendary wild man poet named Egon Bondy, whom Eurus had met at a psychiatric clinic. Egon Bondy contributed lyrics to the band's original songs and offered the Plastics the use of his one-room apartment on Neredova Street as a rehearsal space. Bondy was a vocal opponent of the regime, but his criticism came from the revolutionary left, and he was just as hostile to consumer capitalism. Bondy was a good 15 years older than Eurus, and his connection to the Plastics made his work freshly relevant to a new generation of bohemian misfits. The Plastics' first album of songs, set to Bondy's lyrics, was banned in Czechoslovakia, but was released in France under the title Egon Bondy's Happy Hearts Club Band, with band spelt B-A-N-N-E-D. Other bands attached to the Plastics began springing up across the country. Another band of surrealist anarchists called DG307 also gained a strong following, pounding out industrial music with drums, horns, and sheets of metal. Ivan Eurus named this flourishing scene the second culture, placing it not so much against the state as entirely outside its boundaries. The crowds of musicians, poets and concert-goers were sometimes called androshi, undergrounders. The police began to monitor the scene closely, hovering outside concerts and taking down everyone's ID on the way out. In March 1974, officials were shocked by the size of the crowd at an underground rock festival held outside České Budějovice, and assumed it was part of a coordinated anti-state protest. The festival was broken up by police with attack dogs. Hundreds of concert-goers were rounded up and herded into an underpass towards the train station, where they were beaten with truncheons. Students and young workers were arrested and brought back to Prague, where their long hair was shaved off. On the face of it, there was no real need for the regime to crack down so hard. The Plastics' style was certainly distasteful to the authorities, but there were no protest songs in their repertoire, no direct incitements to youthful rebellion. The regime simply couldn't tolerate the presence of a cultural phenomenon that could flourish so completely outside its margins. The STB was tormented by suspicions that some kind of shadowy Western conspiracy was at work behind the underground scene. Dana Nemtsova, a Prague psychologist who helped organise the České Budějovice event, was pulled in and asked how it was possible to organise such a huge gathering. When she told them, word of mouth. The interrogators scoffed, and they told her it would take hundreds of people to pull off something like that. No, she insisted, it just happens spontaneously. All you do is put the word out and it happens. It's all because we want to do it. You don't need a conspiracy to do this. The Communist Party's campaign against the band shifted into high gear. Ruda Pravo denounced the Plastics as long-haired, neurotic drug addicts. State media portrayed the underground music scene as a seedy hotbed of criminality. In an unintentionally comic episode of the state TV police drama Major Zeman, the clean-cut hero of the series was pitted against a cell of terrorist hippies with handguns who performed screeching rock music to crowds of hypnotised young people. Connection to the Plastics was unmistakable and ridiculous. The trial of the second culture. State persecution was nerve-wracking, but it heightened the sense of romance in the underground and led its members to identify with the rich history of Czech descent. One day in 1974, between prison stints, Ivan Yurus travelled out to the village of Liznica with 45 other Androshi. They were on their way to see the debut performance of a new band which would be playing with the Plastics and DG 307. The excited music fans got out at the train station, then trudged for a mile through dusky, half-frozen fields towards Liznica. Their mood, Yurus wrote, was one of sheer joy. As we walked through the bleak countryside, many of us experienced an intense feeling which some expressed in words. It reminded us of the pilgrimages of the first Hussites into the mountains. Sometime in early March 1976, at the suggestion of a mutual friend, Václav Havel agreed to meet Ivan Yurus in Prague. Despite their mutual suspicion, the two hit it off. Havel was of an older generation than the Plastics, but he quickly grasped that the underground music scene was a fine example of that secret streamlet trickling beneath the surface of official communist culture. The Plastics' chaotic Dionysian music came from a very different sensibility from Havel's precise and thoughtful writing, but they shared a common approach: to create culture as though censorship didn't exist. Yurus played Havel some music from the Plastics and other underground bands, and Havel instantly felt there was something special and authentic about it. He recognised, he said, a disturbing magic in the music and a kind of inner warning. After talking for hours, the two men decided to go out to a pub where the friendly barman locked the doors and opened the cellar vaults. They drank and talked all night. Havel agreed to come to the Plastics' next performance, which was scheduled in 2 weeks' time, but the concert never took place. On the 17th of March, the secret police swooped, arresting 19 people, including Yurus, musicians from the Plastics, DG 307, and concert organisers. Police raided apartments across Prague, confiscating letters, artwork, instruments, tapes, and homemade amplifiers that had been put together from components. The arrests were widely reported and condemned in the Western media. Ruda Pravo defended the police action with its usual dreary clichés. Our society will not tolerate any forms of hooliganism or public disorder, and quite naturally will resist any moral filth and efforts to infect our youth. Havel left his cottage at once and came back to Prague to see what he could do to help. He approached other prominent Czech writers and intellectuals and was pleased to find that many of them were as ready as he was to shrug off the torpor that had set in since the Soviet invasion. Ever the pragmatist, Havel suggested they begin modestly with a simple petition to release the prisoners, which would give the regime space to retreat rather than force them to dig in. In the end, only 4 of the defendants were sent to prison. Ivan Yirus received the longest sentence of 18 months for organised disturbance of the peace. Saxophonist Vratislav Brabenets received 8 months. The figure most conspicuously absent from the list of those arrested was the Plastics lyricist Egon Bondy. Several times, Bondy had warned Yirus and others not to tell him too much, that he was not the kind of person who could keep a secret. That was all the warning they got. Bondy had been collaborating with the STB for more than a decade. From 1961 to 1968, the radical poet handed over 181 reports under the codename Klima. After a 5-year hiatus, he was given a new codename, Mao, and between 1973 and 77, he delivered another 110 reports. It's unlikely that Bondy was able to pass on any meaningful information. There was no Western-directed conspiracy to overthrow the state through rock and roll, after all. But the revelation of his long-term collaboration with the secret police led some old friends to keep their distance. Ivan Yirus, who had suffered more than any other figure in the underground music scene, forgave Bondy and continued to praise him as the patriarch of the Czech underground. Václav Havel and his fellow petitioners were dismayed by the prison sentences handed out to Ivan Yirus and the others, but also somewhat heartened by the solidarity and conviviality that had rallied a loose-knit group of writers, former party members, conservative Catholics and misfits to the musicians' defence. In December, the group reconvened to see how they might continue to press the case for human rights. In the weeks that followed, the group drafted a joint declaration for the new year. The text praised the government for signing the human rights provisions in the 1975 Helsinki Accords, but then noted, regrettably, that such rights only existed in Czechoslovakia on paper. The invocation of the Helsinki Accords put the regime on the back foot. The Soviet Union and its satellites had not demurred when asked to commit to the human rights clauses at Helsinki, never imagining they would be called to account for their own abuses. The glaring gap between the noble sentiments expressed in the Accords and the regime's behaviour gave Havel and his associates the room to run a campaign that was moral rather than ostensibly political in its aims. Havel's group was therefore at pains to point out that they were not a political organisation, which would have been illegal at the time, but merely a loose, informal group of concerned citizens. They decided to appoint 3 spokespersons to forestall the group from being silenced if one of its leaders was arrested. The 3 spokespersons were Václav Havel, Jerzy Hayek, who was a former minister under Dubček, and Professor Jan Patočka, the elderly philosopher much admired by Havel. By January 1977, the group had discreetly gathered 242 signatures and were ready to launch themselves under the name of Charter 77. On the 5th of January, Václav Havel crossed the river and walked up the hill to the apartment of a fellow Charter 77 activist, Zdeněk Urbáněk. Havel's car was out of action. Someone had cut the hydraulic cables on the clutch, so he had to make his way through the icy streets on foot. At Urbánek's apartment, the 2 men began stuffing copies of the Charter into envelopes, which they planned to send to media organisations and institutions all over the world. After a while, Havel's roguish drinking companion, Pavel Landowski, showed up. Landowski, who was a popular film actor with a broken nose and a Zapata moustache, had brought along Ludvík Vaculík, another Charter signatory. When the envelopes were ready, Havel, Vatselik and Landowski piled into the actors' car, intending to discreetly slot them into various postal boxes across the city. The cloak and dagger nature of the excursion put the three men in a merry mood, but as they drove through Prague, they realised they were being followed by a squad of unmarked police cars. There are several accounts of what happened next. The most colourful version came from Landowski, who claimed that when he realised they were being followed, he hit the accelerator, then took a sharp turn into a side street, causing two of the police cars to skate across the icy street and to smash into each other. In the confusion, Landowski was able to pull up at a mailbox. Havel flew out of the passenger seat with a bag of letters and stuffed them into the slot. He jumped back into the car and they shot off down Lenin Street, but the road was blocked by police vehicles. Two more pulled up behind them, forcing Landowski to come to a screeching halt. Dozens of police officers ran to the car, but the actor had locked the doors internally. The police pounded on the bonnet, ordering them to get out. But Landowski turned to Havel and said cheerfully, "See, now they'll pound away at the car, they'll get a bit tired, and when they start pounding us, it won't hurt so much." Havel, sitting next to him, said dryly that this was a fine way to begin a struggle for human rights. Havel reasoned that since they'd done nothing wrong, they should have nothing to fear. But when he unlocked his door, the police yanked him out horizontally. "They sucked him out like a rolled-up carpet," Landowski said. "All I saw was the shoes." Vatselik was hoisted out of the car in a similar fashion, but Landowski stayed put in the driver's seat with his big hands fixed to the steering wheel. Then an officer entered the car, put a gun to his head, and ordered him to follow the police cars to the station. Both he and Havel were released from custody late that night, then brought in every day the following week for further questioning. Landowski was a natural raconteur, and the story surely grew in the telling. The legend helped the signatories of Charter 77 to build a mythology around the group's origins, binding them together in friendship and good humour. Devout lackeys of imperialism. The launch of Charter 77 made news all over the world, but in Prague, its impact was muffled by censorship and by the small number of signatories. Some intellectuals had refused to sign it on principle, irked by the elitist appeal to abstract human rights and the absence of a concrete call to political action. But the Charter's call for the state to observe the Helsinki human rights obligations was in itself a political act that badly unnerved the party leadership and provoked it to lash out at the Charter signatories in Ruda Pravo as washouts and self-appointees, as devout lackeys of imperialism and bitter anti-socialists. Readers must have wondered what the fuss was about, for no part of the Charter was actually quoted. For weeks, the SDB conducted house searches and interrogations of the signatories and their associates. Many lost their jobs, their telephones were removed, and their driver's licences confiscated. In offices and factories, workers were asked to sign an anti-Charter document as they went to collect their wages. The official campaign against Charter 77 culminated in a depressing event at the National Theatre on the 26th of January. Prominent Czech performers and celebrities awkwardly took their seats in an orchestrated show of public support for the regime that came to be known as the Anti-Charter Rally. On stage, actress and party activist Irina Shvortsova denounced the Charter signatories as opportunists and traitors. Jan Verick, who had hoped the event would be low-key, cringed when the TV cameras singled him out. At the end, the participants were expected to line up and signed the anti-charter document, rededicating themselves to new works committed to socialism and peace. Ruda Pravo published their signatures the next day. Karel Gott later claimed he had no idea what was in the text of the document. "I thought I was signing an attendance list," he said. The furious official backlash against Charter 77 gave it far more publicity than was warranted by the relatively small number of signatories and convinced many people it must have merit. After the National Theatre event, author Ivan Klima fell into conversation with 3 workers delivering coal to his apartment block. One of them leant over and quietly asked if he had a copy of that charter. Klima, who had not signed it for fear his daughter would be refused entry into an art school, was nonetheless happy to fetch a copy and watched the men as they pored over the document, reading each line closely, caught up in the pleasure of reading forbidden literature. On the 14th of January, Václav Havel was formally arrested and charged with subversion of the state. With Havel in jail, Jan Patočka stepped up as spokesperson for Charter 77, but the elderly philosopher's health was failing. In March, Patočka was in bed with bronchitis, but managed to rouse himself for a meeting with the Dutch foreign minister. The meeting enraged the authorities, who brought him in for 3 consecutive days of interrogation. On the night of the 3rd of March, 1977, Patočka woke up with terrible chest pains and was admitted to hospital, where he died 10 days later. Jan Patočka's death was inevitably seen as another Czech martyrdom. More than 1,000 people attended his funeral. During the ceremony, STB agents hovered around the mourners, taking note of who was attending. Police helicopters flew overhead, and motorcycles revved their engines to drown out the voices of the eulogies. The disruption was organised with the help of the priest, who was an STB collaborator. Marta Kubišová sang a song at the funeral written especially for the occasion. Marta's voice had lost none of its strength and soulfulness. After Patočka's death, she became one of the 3 spokespersons for Charter 77 and a regular visitor at the Havels' country house. Marta had since married another filmmaker, Jan Moravec. When she became pregnant with her daughter, she resigned as Charter spokesperson, but the state continued its surveillance of her everyday activities. Marta was aware that one of her neighbours was monitoring her comings and goings. The STB had also secretly recruited her husband to curb her antisocial activities. The marriage ended when Kubišová learnt of his extramarital affairs. She only found out that Moravec had been spying on her when the secret police records were made public after the Velvet Revolution. Paul Wilson suspected the police had stepped up their surveillance of him as well. Occasionally the phone in his apartment rang, but he heard no one on the line when he answered, just some odd sounds. He spotted people in his local pub he'd never seen before, just sitting, not talking to anybody. When a new couple moved in upstairs, one of them asked Paul to look after a package for them. Paul's wife wondered if it contained a listening device. Paul had been secretly recording interviews with Charter 77 figures for the Canadian media. One morning, the secret police arrived at his door at 6 a.m. Paul was already up, dressed and ready to head out for an interview, but he asked the police for a minute to get dressed while his wife frantically tried to conceal any compromising materials lying around the living room. When Paul opened the door, they took him away. As the police car zoomed along the embankment of the Vltava, Paul knew his time in Prague was coming to an end. He gazed at the spiky skyline, the Charles Bridge, the castle, in the early dawn darkness, thinking he might never see them again. In the interrogation room, the officers said that they knew all about him and they invited him to speak more about his friends. "I'm happy to tell you anything you want to know about what I think and what I do," he replied. "But if you want to know what my friends think and what they do, you ask them. Don't ask me." Another officer entered the room, pounded his fist on the table and threatened him with jail. But Paul knew that, in the last resort, his Canadian passport would give him safe passage out of the country. The questions, threats and abuse continued until 2 p.m. when they released him. 2 days later, he was told he must leave the country. After 10 tumultuous years in this strange kingdom, it was time to go. The power of the powerless. Charter 77 did succeed in shining an international spotlight on human rights abuses in Czechoslovakia. Embarrassed, the regime changed tack. The Interior Ministry instituted a new policy, the Asanace, or decontamination campaign. Dissidents were threatened in their homes by the secret police, who urged them to leave the country before some terrible accident could befall them and their families. Targets of the campaign were beaten up in their apartments, burnt with cigarette butts, and on one occasion choked into unconsciousness. Many Chartists, including the actor Pavel Landowski and Pavel Kohut, were terrorised into cutting their losses and leaving the country. The plastic people of the universe were also battered by the unremitting hostility of the state. They were running out of venues. 3 weeks after performing at a house in the countryside, the house was burnt down. The authorities pressured their saxophonist, Vratislav Brabenec, into emigrating to Canada, where he became a gardener. Ivan Yurus spent most of the decade in prison, where he wrote his most celebrated collection of poems, Margot's Swan Song, as well as a collection of poems and fairy tales for his daughter. Ivan Yurus was changed by his years in jail. Paul Wilson noticed that prison toughened him. He was always very uncompromising, Paul said, but prison turned him into a really tough guy, an angry guy. The beatings, arrests, and forced emigrations led some of the core members of Charter 77, including Havel, to set up a new opposition group calling itself the Committee for the Unjustly Persecuted, or VONS. VONS would take on a more activist role than Charter 77, monitoring and reporting on cases of victims of arbitrary actions by the police or judiciary. Havel had been in an erratic mood since his release from detention. He blamed himself for Jan Patočka's death and was deeply ashamed for having played into the regime's hands by writing a too clever by half plea for release that Ruda Pravo was able to recast as a cowardly sellout of Charter 77. To prove them wrong, he resumed his political activities with an almost manic intensity. After VONS announced its existence to the world in April 1978, the STB built an observation post on the grounds of the Havel's cottage at Hradeček. A policeman followed him whenever he walked his dog around the property. Havel took the heightened surveillance with as much good humour as he could muster. He was busy drafting his most famous and influential essay, The Power of the Powerless, an exposition of how the state controls its citizens by pressing them into a performance of obedience. At the centre of the essay is an imaginary greengrocer who consents to place a sign in his shop window with the slogan, "Workers of the world unite." The slogan itself is meaningless to the greengrocer, who is unlikely to feel strongly one way or the other about global worker solidarity. The real meaning, Havel argues, is embedded in the sign, not the slogan. He wrote, "It contains a subliminal but very definite message. Verbally, this message might be expressed this way. I, the greengrocer, live here and I know what I must do. I behave in the manner expected of me. I can be depended upon and am beyond reproach. I am obedient and therefore I have the right to be left in peace." It would be a different matter, Havel wrote, if the sign had said more bluntly and truthfully, "I am afraid and therefore unquestioningly obedient." But, he wrote, the regime is happy to spare the greengrocer's feelings in this matter. It makes it easier for him to hide his subservience behind an upbeat sentiment, while at the same time concealing the low foundations of the regime's own power. Havel concluded that the multitude of small gestures, like the greengrocer's sign, made everyone complicit in the system, to the extent that they become the system. The regime requires mass participation in its lies to continue to exist. But when it demands that people disbelieve their own eyes, something inside them automatically rebels. It's this human need to live in truth, even under the most absurd and dangerous circumstances, that gives power to the powerless. This longing for authenticity compelled people to create a more meaningful space outside the regime, in the shadow world that Ivan Yurus had called the second culture, and the Catholic dissident Václav Benda dubbed a parallel polis. Secret workshops sprang up around Prague and in the countryside, producing prohibited books, essays and albums in samizdat format. The books were often produced to high professional standards, but time with them was preciously short. Readers would stay up all night or call in sick for a day just to finish a book before having to pass it on to another friend. American author Philip Roth made several visits to Prague in the 1970s, and he was deeply moved by people's pursuit of literature in such dangerous circumstances. Back in the United States, Roth commented that in Prague, nothing goes and everything matters, whereas here, everything goes and nothing matters.
This is the end of CD 13. The book continues on CD 14. CD 14.
Plans for prison. On the night of the 28th of May, 1979, Václav Havel was arrested again, along with other Von's members. This time, the state was determined to put them away. He and his 5 co-defendants stood trial together, and all were found guilty of subversion. Havel was given 4.5 years. During his long sentence, he was passed on from prison to prison. At Hermanitsa, he spot-welded metal grates. At Borgi, he worked in the laundry and then was put to work stripping insulation from wires and cables. Before going in, Havel had set himself a strict regime of self-improvement. He resolved to remain healthy, to write several plays, to learn to speak German and improve his English, and to study the Bible closely. He achieved none of these things, but he did succeed in his most serious ambition to reconstitute himself psychologically after years of stress and worry and shame over his perceived failures and shortcomings. This deeply existential and personal experience involved a long and painful process of honest introspection. In his letters to Olga, he chided himself for his excessive politeness, his foolish overestimation of his own cleverness, his tendency to trust the wrong people, and his constant need to explain himself. President Husak was no less of a captive than Havel, albeit one living in a vastly larger and more comfortable cell. Husak was still haunted by his traumatic past. Shortly after becoming president, he invited his closest political ally, Lubomir Strugl, to join him on a strange excursion to Kolodyeje Castle, where Husak had once been imprisoned. As they walked through the grounds, Strugl thought, "This is bad." He said, "Husak led me into the cellar. We were both silent, and I knew what was going on. We went through that long dungeon. It was dirty and unkempt. Husak led me to a corner and said, 'There was a wooden cell here, and I spent 9 months in it in solitary confinement.' And he started crying. Then he said, 'I wanted you to see it. I'll never come here again.'" Husak's first wife, Magda, had died years earlier. In 1973, he married Viera Milerova, a Slovak journalist and translator. Viera was a lifelong communist, but had retained a degree of creativity and humanity, and she urged Husak to rehabilitate the former friends he'd expelled from the party. Husak found some solace in his wife's warmth and conversation, but their time together was brief. In October 1977, Viera travelled to the spa town of Bardejov, where she injured her shoulder in a fall. A helicopter came to fly her to Bratislava for medical treatment, but the night was foggy, and the helicopter crashed in a cornfield near the runway. Everyone on board was killed. Strugl brought Husak the awful news. Gustav took it calmly, he recalled. He sobbed some and said nothing. Strugl asked if there was anything he could do for him. Husak said he wanted to see the body and asked him to arrange it. Husak was a widower again. He would not remarry. 19 years. The 1980s brought a sense of immobility to everyday life in Prague. A visiting New York Times reporter noted the grey shroud over what was once one of Europe's most creative, articulate and communicative cities. The gloom in the streets depressed him. He wrote, "Each individual or small group seemed to be unaware of others, bent only on fulfilling quickly the task that brought them out of their houses in the first place." The lethargy in Prague was symptomatic of the party's sclerotic leadership. Husak, who was now in his 70s, was almost blind. Each year he would read his New Year's Day speech behind reading glasses with increasingly thick lenses that made his eyes appear cartoonishly large. In Moscow, the situation was even worse. 3 geriatric leaders, Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, Konstantin Chernenko, passed away in quick succession. On the 11th of March 1985, the Soviet leadership held its breath and elected Mikhail Gorbachev, a bright 52-year-old reformer, as General Secretary. Unlike his hardline predecessors, Gorbachev was affable, reasonable, and by Soviet standards, quite liberal. He called for a policy of glasnost, greater openness, and more ambitiously for perestroika, restructuring of the Soviet economy to make it more efficient and responsive to consumer needs. In April 1987, Gorbachev visited Prague, raising hopes that he would put Husak on the spot by publicly calling for his government to follow Moscow's lead, but the Soviet leader chose to be diplomatic. He declared that reform was essential, but that it was up to Czechoslovakia to choose whether to pursue it. Gorbachev's spokesperson was more direct. When asked by journalists to explain the difference between the Gorbachev reforms and those of Alexander Dubček, he quipped provocatively, 19 years. Gorbachev's reformist message left Husak and the party in an excruciating bind. Having frozen their society at the bidding of one Soviet leader, how were they to unfreeze it at the bidding of another? Their confusion made their public utterances nonsensical. In October, Husak declared that Czechoslovakia must not fall behind, but then quickly cautioned, we must not hasten solutions too quickly, and we should minimise the risks that could occur. In December, Husak, enfeebled by multiple strokes, was forced to resign as First Secretary, but was permitted to retain his ceremonial post as President. When Prime Minister Rakowski of Poland came to visit him at Prague Castle, he noted that Husak seemed very tired and barely able to exchange a few banal pleasantries. Rakowski met the new generation of party leaders in Prague, led by the rigidly conservative 67-year-old Miloš Jakeš. The Polish government, under pressure from Gorbachev and from the dissident trade union Solidarity, was ready to go some way down the road of political and economic reform. But Jakeš told Rakowski that he felt no such pressure from his people. As long as Czechs have their hot dogs and beer, he said, there'll be no revolution. Gustav Husak had become an isolated figure. In the summer, he retreated for 6 weeks to the presidential country house at Lani. The housekeepers at the estate later told his successor, Václav Havel, that Husak passed the days in a strange manner, sitting alone in a room, not reading, simply staring at the wall, while uniformed police officers paced up and down the hall outside. Occasionally, the staff would bring him food. And when the employees told me this, Havel said, I suddenly understood that he was simulating the situation in his prison cell. He made for himself a kind of temporary, more comfortable prison at Lani. Chapter 11. To Light the Magic Lantern. The 7 Wonders of Czechoslovakia. Everybody has a job. Although everybody has a job, nobody works. Although nobody works, the plan is fulfilled up to 105%. Although the plan is fulfilled up to 105%, there's nothing in the shops. Although there's nothing in the shops, we've got enough of everything. Although we've got enough of everything, everybody steals. Although everybody steals, nothing ever goes missing anywhere. And the 8th wonder of the world is that it has been working for 41 years. Velvet Revolution slogan. Hope rises again. In his 5th year in prison, Václav Havel came down with pneumonia and was admitted belatedly to the prison hospital. Worried that their most famous prisoner might die under incarceration, the authorities suspended Havel's sentence and released him when he was well enough to stand upright. Once recovered, he returned to writing plays but was kept under constant STB surveillance. One spring evening in 1987, Havel stepped outside his apartment to take his dog for a walk along the Vltava embankment. As he approached the bright lights of the National Theatre, he saw a crush of police cars and a crowd of excited bystanders. Curious, he edged his way forward and saw the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, emerge from the theatre to cheers from the crowd. Gorbachev walked past the well-wishers, smiling and waving, and then Havel realised, with some embarrassment, that the Soviet leader was smiling and waving directly at him. All Havel could do was grin shyly and wave back. Havel was annoyed by the cheers for Gorbachev. He despaired that the Czechs would forever look to an outside figure to liberate them, rather than do it themselves. But a decade had passed since the signing of Charter 77, and nothing had changed. Gorbachev was a far more powerful symbol of hope to Praguers than the small group of Charter signatories still living almost invisibly on the margins of society. Nonetheless, as the 80s came to a close, the fog of fear and apathy in Prague slowly cleared, allowing a new cohort of younger activists to see a way forward. Disappointed with the Chartists' lack of visibility and frustrated with their carefully calibrated anti-political approach, these students and young dissidents were the first to test the limits of state control. They had no memory of the demoralising defeat of 1968 and had less to lose from the system of threats and inducements that had daunted their parents. In April 1988, a group of disgruntled Chartists and young Christian pacifists formed a new organisation, the Independent Peace Association, or IPA, which called for the right to refuse military service, to build trust between the state and its citizens, and for the repair of the ravaged environment. The IPA operated in parallel with the older activists, but more visibly. They published their own Samizdat journal, they met with peace activists from Western Europe, they staged hunger strikes, and organised tree plantings in clear-felled forests. The old absurdist instincts resurfaced. In July 1988, a group calling itself the Society for a Merrier Present paraded up and down the Charles Bridge, wearing helmets made from watermelons, while holding up completely blank banners. The police arrived and hurriedly confiscated the banners, while the onlookers laughed. In August, performance artist Tomáš Rula publicly set himself on fire before falling face down in a pool of mud unharmed. His performance earned him a beating from the police. For some reason, he said cheerfully, they see it as a political statement. The 20th anniversary of the Soviet invasion was fast approaching, but Charter 77 decided to bow out of any public demonstration, not wanting to risk police violence. The departure of Havel and others for the countryside meant that the authorities were caught napping on the weekend when the IPA decided to hold their own peaceful protest. On the morning of the 21st of August, young IPA members milled around the city centre, identifying each other by wearing prominent tricolour ribbons. At 1 p.m, they gathered at the top of Wenceslas Square to lay flowers. After that, there was some uncertainty as to what would happen next. One of the IPA's founders, Hanna Marvanova, gave a speech in support of peace and perestroika. Incredulous shoppers and passers-by stopped to listen. Nothing like this had happened for years in Prague. The crowd swelled, and within an hour, a spontaneous public seminar broke out. A 9-point document was drafted, calling for the departure of Soviet troops, for free elections, and support for human rights. The police hovered nervously at the periphery, unsure of how to respond. By 6 p.m, the crowd had become a throng of 10,000, the vast majority of them in their 20s. A chant went up for freedom and democracy as they marched to the old town square. More passers-by joined in. Others simply applauded as it passed. Then the crowd broke up peacefully and everyone went home. The success of the rally shook the Charter 77 leaders out of their pessimism and forced them to admit the 20-somethings had roused the city from its apathy. They were particularly delighted by the spontaneous, improvised nature of it all. "We won't be satisfied with things as they are," declared the IPA's co-founder, Tomáš Dvořák. "After 20 years, hope rises again in us." In October, the government declared that the 70th anniversary of Czechoslovak independence in 1918 was to be a national holiday. The announcement caught people by surprise. Until now, the regime had tried to scrub Masaryk's republic from the national memory, but the decree was merely a ploy to encourage Praguers to take a long weekend in the countryside rather than be tempted to join any anti-government protests in the city. State television and Ruda Pravo warned that unofficial demonstrations would not be tolerated. This was no empty threat. On the 28th of October, 10,000 people flowed into Wenceslas Square chanting "Masaryk" and "Freedom." As they began their demonstration, white-helmeted riot police with attack dogs emerged from the subway entrances and side streets. They laid into the crowd with their truncheons, knocking people to the ground. Protesters on the periphery of the violence hooted with derision at the police. A young man who placed flowers at the foot of the St. Wenceslas statue was dragged off while protesters chanted, "Fascists!" Someone was seen singing the national anthem even as he was being clubbed down. Michael Dochekal, a drama student, saw an isolated policeman being chased by some furious protesters. He picked up a heavy paving stone and weighed it in his hand, and for several agonising moments he wondered if he was really the kind of person who could hurl a stone at a fellow human being. The stone did not leave his hand, but he was shaken by the experience. The demonstrators scattered and regrouped in the old town square between the astronomical clock and the Jan Hus monument. As soon as they resumed their protest, a line of armoured personnel carriers with machine gun turrets entered from a side street, followed by water cannon trucks. Clouds of tear gas and blasts of freezing cold water hit the crowd. Then the APCs lurched forward, sending the demonstrators flying in all directions, clearing the square. Afterwards, riot police scoured the streets, looking for more protesters to beat up. Some 200 people were arrested. The IPA founders, Hanna Mavronova and Tomáš Dvořák, were charged, absurdly, with preparing to commit incitement. The following day, Ruda Pravo accused the two of being in the pay of foreign governments. The never-ending symposium. The new defiant mood encouraged Charter 77 and other independent groups to announce an international symposium provocatively titled Czechoslovakia 88, to be held at Prague's Hotel Paris in November. The nervous authorities neither gave nor refused permission for the symposium to go ahead. Foreign dignitaries and scholars, journalists and human rights activists accepted the invitation to come to Prague. But several days before the scheduled opening, police were given orders to arrest the Czech participants. Václav Havel managed to dodge the police long enough to slip into the Hotel Paris's breakfast room on the symposium's opening morning. But as soon as he sat down at the table of foreign delegates and journalists, he was pulled out of his chair by a trio of police officers. Havel said, "Well, in this moment I am arrested." He had just enough time to declare the symposium open before he was dragged out of the room. The startled foreigners were then approached by a muscular woman in a tight leather jacket holding a bunch of flowers. She handed each of the delegates an unmarked envelope containing a photocopied message. The threat was more comic than sinister. Achtung, it began. I am warning you that the action called Symposium Czechoslovakia 88 is illegal and its performance would be contrary to the interests of Czechoslovak working people and consequently illegal. In this connection, your efforts to take part in this action would be considered as a manifestation of hostility to Czechoslovakia, and in virtue of this, we should have to draw relevant consequences against your person. Václav Havel was detained for 4 days and, as convener, never did get to officially close the symposium. The secret police searched his home and confiscated his personal computer. He fired off a letter of complaint to the Prime Minister, Ladislav Adamets, noting in passing that the police had thought the keyboard was the computer, that the computer was something they called an amplifier, and the monitor was a television. As the new year came around, the regime steeled itself for another unwelcome anniversary. The 16th of January 1989 would mark 20 years from the day of Jan Palach's self-immolation. The week leading up to the anniversary was taken up with demonstrations in Wenceslas Square. Each day, protesters were beaten and knocked off their feet by water cannons. The young protesters gained courage with each day. At times, they had run from the police, but at other critical moments, they had found it in them to stand their ground, and their fear was now tempered by excitement and a sense of solidarity and possibility. As they were dragged away, they chanted, "Tomorrow, here again," and there would be more people in the square the next day. By the end of the week, Ústec metro station was filled with the lingering stench of tear gas. Journalist Michael Zantowski, who was soon to become Havel's press secretary, saw that many of them had crossed a psychological threshold. He wrote, "When you were faced for the first time with a solid line of space-helmeted, grim-faced young men with their metre-long batons and Star Wars shields, with the bare-toothed snarling attack dogs straining at their leads, or with the business end of a water cannon, you wish with all your might to be somewhere else. When it happens for the 5th time, and you are still around, and still the same person, give or take a couple of bruises, it starts to feel like something you can take." On the morning of the anniversary, police cordoned off the streets, but some 5,000 protesters made it into the square anyway and were dispersed once again with tear gas. Havel tried to get in but was arrested and charged with incitement and obstructing public order and then sentenced to 8 months' prison. International outrage ensured it was a short stay behind bars. President Mitterrand of France wrote a personal letter of protest to Gustave Hussac. A student petition demanding Havel's release was handed to the authorities, and to their amazement, it was accepted, and the playwright was out the next day. Pankratz Prison's parole board cited Havel's good behaviour and tidiness in making his bunk. That night there was a party in the Havel's apartment. Among the guests was Alexander Dubček, who appeared at their door like a ghost of the Prague Spring. Dubček and Havel talked for 3 hours. Afterwards, Havel said he thought Dubček's visit was significant. The former politician had sniffed a change in the wind. 6 weeks later, on the 29th of June, Charter 77 produced a new petition, modestly titled "A Few Sentences." The document called for the release of political prisoners, for an end to censorship, for freedom of assembly and religion, for a review of the ecological impact of heavy industry, and for an opening of a debate on the Stalinist era and the events of 1968. 40,000 people put their names to the petition within 3 months. 80 times as many signatories as Charter 77. A hole in the Iron Curtain. The heady sense of possibility in Prague was chilled that month by the massacre of Chinese students and workers in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. The Chinese leaders had given the Prague dissidents an insight into how a frightened communist regime might use lethal violence to protect itself against its own citizens. Czechoslovak party leader Miloš Jakeš welcomed the news of the Beijing massacre almost gleefully, and there were fears that he too might order a military crackdown. But the Presidium was paralysed between Jakeš's old guard and the pro-Gorbachev reformists. While the hardliners grimly hung on to power in Czechoslovakia and East Germany, their fraternal parties in Hungary and Poland had already travelled a long way down the road of reform. In June 1989, the Polish regime buckled to popular pressure and opened the majority of its parliamentary seats to free elections. The result was a communist wipeout. The opposition Solidarity Group won every openly contested seat in the lower house and all but one in the Senate. And a non-communist, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, was appointed Prime Minister. Mikhail Gorbachev made no effort to interfere. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. At the same time, the Hungarian government declared that its citizens would be allowed to travel freely to Austria. Crucially, they extended the same right to citizens of other communist countries. The announcement inspired thousands of East Germans to cross the border into Czechoslovakia by train or in their two-stroke Trabant cars, hoping to make the long round trip through Hungary and Austria into prosperous democratic West Germany, where they could claim automatic citizenship. The Czechoslovak authorities responded to this sudden influx by closing their border with Hungary, hoping the dejected East Germans would simply go home. Instead, they drove straight towards Prague, to the West German embassy in Malá Strana, to ask for political asylum. The streets around the embassy in Prague became clogged with parked Trabants as refugees climbed the fence and camped in the embassy's gardens. The overcrowded refugee camp was a painful embarrassment for the East German regime and a major headache for their Czechoslovak comrades. After weeks of negotiations, an agreement was reached to transport the East German refugees by a special closed train to West Germany. The decision was announced from the embassy balcony to ecstatic cries of joy from the East Germans. West German student Katrin Bock was among the crowd in Prague, looking on as the excited refugees boarded buses to take them to the train station. I was surrounded by happy Czechs who wished the East Germans all the best, who clapped at each bus and thought that it was high time for something to change in Czechoslovakia when even the East Germans are demonstrating and leaving the country in their thousands. After the buses left, the abandoned Trabants were dismantled for spare parts. Best wishes for the year to come. On the 5th of October, keen-eyed readers of Ruda Pravo might have caught a small birthday greeting in the personal notices to a Ferdinand Vaniek, thanking him for all his hard work and wishing him all the best in the year to come. The birthday boy was in fact Václav Havel. Vaniek was the name he used as an alter ego in his plays. The notice, along with a smudgy photo of Havel, was a prank, sent in by his friends to trick the authorities into publishing a cheery salutation to their enemy in the Communist Party daily. Dissidents who had not opened Rue de Bravo for decades rushed out to buy a copy for a laugh. Others bought copies just to see what this notorious dissident looked like. The prank was revealed on Radio Free Europe and published all over the world. A few days later, police were sent to arrest Havel in his flat to prevent him taking part in any Independence Day protest rallies. Havel was laid up in bed, feeling unwell. When Olga demanded the police produce a warrant, he wandered out from the bedroom in his pyjamas. "Oh, let them in, Olga," he said. "You could get them fired." The police agreed to place him under hospital detention. That evening, a small coterie of well-wishers gathered on the street outside his hospital room to chant, "Long live Havel! Long live Havel!" Strange beings. Meanwhile, across the border, East German authorities were staggering under a wave of massive, peaceful protest marches in East Berlin, Dresden and Leipzig. On the 9th of November, the East Berlin party boss, Günter Schabowski, held a dramatic evening press conference to announce that East Germans would no longer be prevented from crossing into West Berlin. An Italian journalist asked when the law would come into effect. As I understand it," Schabowski replied uncertainly, flipping through the pages of his document, "it goes into effect immediately." Then with more certainty, "without delay." The border guards at the Berlin Wall had been given no orders to this effect, but when excited East Berliners rushed to the checkpoints, the guards waved them through. They were greeted on the other side by West Berliners with champagne. Within hours, thousands of East and West Berliners began hacking into the hated wall with pickaxes and hammers. Hoisting one another on top of the 12-foot-high concrete slabs, they danced and sang and wept with joy. In Prague, Charter 77 activists ached as they watched news footage of these once unthinkable scenes. The dissidents were tormented by the suspense of it all. Communism had collapsed, or was collapsing, in Poland, Hungary and East Germany. But they wondered if their own people would summon the courage and resolve to demand the same. Marta Kubishova was now a 47-year-old single mother with a clerical job at a construction company. Between the demands of her job and bringing up her daughter, she no longer had time for opposition activity. But to her annoyance, the STB still kept her under close surveillance. One day, she thought she'd try a trick she'd seen in the movie The French Connection. She walked into a subway station, boarded a carriage, and hung around close to the door, pretending to be absorbed in conversation with a friend. As the doors slid shut, she leapt back onto the platform. Marta gave herself a little round of applause as she watched the furious secret policeman inside the carriage zooming away from her. On the 14th of November, Marta finished work for the day and walked from her office to a nearby recording studio. Inside, she removed her coat and scarf and began her vocal warm-up exercises in front of the microphone. The sound engineer became wide-eyed with fear as he recognised the distinctive voice coming from the speakers. "Bloody hell," he said. "It's Kubishova." He made his apologies and left. The cleaner muttered her excuses, and then she was gone too. Marta had been invited to the studio by film director Fero Fenic, who wanted Marta to sing for the closing credits of his new film about misfits and outsiders called Strange Beings. Marta was still banned from public performance, but Fenic didn't care. The director felt shivers down his spine as he heard Marta's voice, dark and warm, floating above a sustained shimmering chord from the orchestral strings. It sounded hopeful, expectant. Friday, 17th November. A student rally was planned for the 17th of November, but few expected much to come from it. The rally was intended to commemorate a Nazi atrocity, the murder of 9 Czech students by the Gestapo in 1939. The key figure then had been a medical student named Jan Opletal, who had been shot by German civilian police and later died of his wounds in hospital. The Nazis had subsequently closed the universities and condemned 1,000 more students to the concentration camps. Prague's students, to their surprise, were given permission by the communist authorities to hold an anti-fascist remembrance ceremony outside the university's medical faculty in Albertov, near the fortress of Vyšehrad. The organisers had hoped for a crowd of 4,000, but by 4 in the afternoon, more than 15,000 people had shown up. Observers noticed at once that there was something different about this gathering. There was none of the orderliness usually seen at official events. Instead, the students milled about, carrying candles and flags, talking to each other excitedly. When the ceremony began, no one sang along with the official student song. A banner was held up, calling for an end to one-party rule. Other handwritten banners called on students to seize the moment. Who, if not us? When, if not now? The restless crowd formed a candlelit procession from Albertov to Vyšehrad's Cemetery of National Heroes. They heard an emotional speech from one of the elderly survivors of the 1939 student massacre. Another speaker urged the students to accept the lessons of the Nazi occupation. He said, "Our forerunners well knew that oppression was worse than death, that freedom must be fought for, and that it is not possible to live without it." Afterwards, a cry went up to march on to the city centre. The authorised commemoration was now an unauthorised protest march. The mass of students proceeded along the Vltava embankment, chanting and singing. Trams halted to allow the protesters to pass, while motorists honked their horns in approval. When the rally turned right into Narodny Street, actors and staff from the National Theatre came out onto the balcony to applaud them. Then, halfway up Narodny Street, hundreds of riot police with helmets and perspex shields jogged out to form a defensive wall, blocking the students' path. Behind the rows of police stood members of the Red Berets, a highly trained anti-terrorist Air Force regiment. The protesters further down the line kept filing into Narodny Street, unable to see the blockage up ahead. Then another line of riot police came rushing out to cordon them off from behind. With nowhere to go, the anxious students sat down on the cold asphalt and began to sing "We Shall Overcome." An elderly veteran of the original Jan Opletal protest of 1939 remained upright, leaning on his walking stick, singing the national anthem, "Where is my home?" As the tension mounted, the protesters produced their keys from their pockets and jingled them musically in front of the bristling riot police, creating a reverberant cacophony that rang out through the street. More police arrived, blocking the lanes and side streets. The students realised they were now boxed in on all sides. Police with loudhailers ordered them to go home, but it was impossible to go anywhere. Then the perspex wall moved forward. The protesters rose to their feet, raised their arms and chanted, "Our hands are empty." Panic rippled through the crowd and the police moved in, swinging their batons, cracking heads. Students ran to the back, only to meet another line of riot police advancing from the rear. The protesters were caught in a human vice, punching, beating and kicking them to the ground. Smaller students were lifted off their feet in the crush of bodies. Armoured personnel carriers charged onto the sidewalks like motorised battering rams, sending people scattering into the side streets where red berets waited to deliver a beating. A Western cameraman was hurled through a shop window, while a Chicago Tribune reporter had her head split open. The soldiers dragged protesters into doorways, tore off their clothes and beat them naked. One protester saw a girl about to be hit and flung himself forward. He was beaten all over his head and body with truncheon blows, while soldiers shouted, "Give it to the motherfucker," on his face. For the protesters, there was nowhere to escape other than through a narrow passage on Narodny Trzeźda, lined on either side by a gauntlet of police who bashed protesters as they ran through. Student Mikhail Kukral saw some frightened high school kids dashing into a doorway and followed them in. He stepped through a red curtain and found himself in a small studio apartment crammed with dozens of whimpering teenagers. A middle-aged woman hissed at them to be quiet and then turned off the lights. In the darkened room, they heard shouts and groans, barking dogs, feet pounding on the pavement. As Narodny Street began to empty, bands of red berets fanned out into the nearby metro stations, attacking groups of commuters on the concourse who had stopped to help the bloodied protesters. Katrine Bock had holed up with her friends in a nearby pub to wait out the storm of violence raging outside. At around 11 p.m, she ventured out to find Narodny Street mostly empty. There was no traffic, but the street was littered with abandoned bags, hats, shoes, and bloodied clothes. It was a strange atmosphere, she said, completely silent. You could see blood on the walls of buildings, and students walking around in a daze, traumatised. As the shocked and wounded protesters staggered back to their homes and dormitories, word spread that the security forces had beaten a student to death. Some of the protesters recalled seeing an inert body on the pavement being picked up and carried off in an ambulance. The 19-year-old victim was identified as Martin Schmidt by a woman named Drahomira Drashka, a porter at one of the student hostels, who claimed to be his girlfriend. News of Martin Schmidt's death was passed on to Petra Uhl from Charter 77, who then gave the story to Radio Free Europe, to the BBC and to Reuters. Petra Uhl was subsequently arrested for defaming the Republic by spreading slanderous information. Miloš Jakeš's government angrily denied that anyone had been killed in the police action. They produced 2 Martin Schmidts for state TV, who were both alive and well. But having lied so often, the government simply wasn't believed. The story jolted Praguers out of their apathy. Until that day, recalled the dissident Jan Urban, there had been a deal between the communist regime and the people. You shut up, and we will take care of you. But the moment people had the impression that their kids were being killed, the deal was off. For once, however, the regime was telling the truth. The dead student, Martin Schmidt, did not exist. The seemingly lifeless figure seen on the pavement was Ludwig Zivchak, a young STB officer sent to infiltrate the student movement. Zivchak, who was very much alive, later claimed that he'd been acting that night as a foot soldier in a complex plot hatched by the STB with the connivance of the KGB. Senior STB officers, he said, had instructed him to encourage the students to march into the city centre where they would be confronted by the security forces. When violence broke out, he said he was instructed to play dead in the street. Drahomira Drashka, his co-conspirator, had played her part by feeding the false story of Schmidt's death to the dissident movement. The idea that the STB would conspire against the communist leadership seemed bizarre. But Zivchak claimed that the STB had wanted to discredit Miloš Jakeš and then depose him in favour of pro-Gorbachev moderates, who could then cut a deal with opposition leaders and keep the Communist Party in power. The implications of Zivchak's allegations were breathtaking. If true, it would mean that the People Power revolution in Prague had in fact been secretly instigated by the secret police. But the conspiracy theory collapses on closer inspection. In 1992, a parliamentary inquiry report found Zivchak's testimony to be technically impossible and unfeasible. It could find no connection between the STB and Drahomira Drashka, who later admitted that she'd made up the story of Schmidt's death to get back at the security forces for the vicious attack that night. Although Zivchak claimed he'd been playing dead, it seems more likely he'd been beaten unconscious in Narodny Street by the security forces, who had failed to recognise him as one of their own. Western journalists and historians reported Zivchak's bold conspiracy claims as fact, basing their stories on an interim report of the parliamentary inquiry, but the inquiry's final report demolished its earlier findings and Zivchak's allegations along with it. Nonetheless, the widespread perception that the regime had murdered a student had set revolutionary forces in motion in Prague. Distressed students returned to Narodny Street to assemble a makeshift shrine to honour Martin Schmidt, lighting small candles on the spot where they believed he had fallen. They strung up a banner to commemorate the parallel student martyrdoms spaced exactly half a century apart. Jan Opletal, 1939. Martin Schmidt, 1989. It was Prague's greatest ever literary joke. The catalyst for the fall of the regime was the death of a fictional character. Sunday, 19th November. On the Sunday, groups of exhausted, frightened students came together at the university to figure out what to do next. As they debated, their outrage gave them fresh reserves of energy. They voted to go on strike, and they called for a nationwide workers' strike against the regime. Prague's actors and stage workers declared their support. Prague's theatres became debating chambers and centres of political activity. That evening, Václav Havel made his way to the Actors' Studio Theatre to convene a meeting of dissident writers, student leaders, conservative Catholics, excommunicated communists, actors and scientists. Ideologically diverse but socially narrow, they recognised they had to become more broadly representative of Czech society. And so they invited Petra Miller, an electrician from the CKD engineering works, and Milan Hruška from the North Bohemian coal mines, into their inner circle. The group, which called itself Civic Forum, demanded the resignation of the Communist Party leadership, the release of all political prisoners, and an inquiry into Friday night's police attack. They repeated the students' call for a general workers' strike to be held on the 27th of November, which would, Havel said, be a referendum on communist rule in Czechoslovakia. Havel was ready to harness the revolutionary potential of the moment and carry it forward in a style that accorded with his convictions and his personality. This was to be a non-violent revolt, directed from the theatres of Prague, where Havel could comfortably manage the unfolding drama. As the excited Civic Forum leaders made their way home that night, the first snow of the season, covered Prague with a powdery white veil. Monday, 20th November. Marek Toman, who was then a philosophy student at Charles University, had not been present at the Friday night student march. He had assumed the officially approved rally was going to be a waste of time and had left town to see one of his favourite bands perform in the countryside. Marek had lived all his young life under the pall of normalisation. He was born in 1967, a year before the Soviet invasion. When the tanks rolled into Prague, his father left for West Germany. He told Marek's mother he would make arrangements so they could follow him. But after a few months, he called and asked them not to come. He had made a new life in Germany without them. Marek's father's flight to the West was deemed a criminal act, and a black mark was recorded against the family name. Marek's mother had to plead with the authorities to get him admitted to high school and to university, and had to assure the authorities of their loyalty. Deeply alienated by the system, Marek avoided military service by faking mental illness and was admitted to a psychiatric institution for 6 weeks. It was actually fine, he recalled. I learnt interesting stories from the others in the group therapy sessions. I didn't mind. Although the Berlin Wall had fallen, Marek thought that the party's nomenklatura would find some way to cling to power in Czechoslovakia. After his weekend in the country, he came back to Prague on the Monday morning, not knowing what to expect. Walking around the corner from the railway station, he saw a student in a black pullover standing under the statue of St. Wenceslas, reading out a statement condemning the police violence. Marek saw that he was trembling with nerves. The student continued reading his statement, but then he stumbled over a line and said in English, "Shit." The use of shit instead of a Czech curse word, of which there are a great many, was, Marek thought, a bit crazy, a bit absurd, and hopeful. He said it was a sign of a fresh wind from abroad which was starting to blow through the city. When I heard him say shit, I thought, maybe something really is going to happen. That evening, at the end of the workday, Praguers spontaneously made their way into the city centre. Soon, Wenceslas Square was a shifting sea of 200,000 excited Praguers holding flags and candles. The great majority were in their 20s or teens. An exhilarating sense of strength and solidarity surged through the crowd. There was, said one student, a feeling of stupendous wholeness and rightness. A chant went up, "Down with Jakeš, down with Husak." Then, in imitation of the students on Friday nights, the demonstrators pulled their keys from their pockets and jingled them. The jangling noise echoed off the buildings, creating an eerie sound that carried through the streets of the city. The message to the regime was clear. Time to go. In hindsight, the end of communist rule seems inevitable, but at the time, no one knew whether they were racing towards a Berlin triumph or a Beijing massacre. Miloš Jakeš, supported by the hardliners on the Presidium, prepared for a crackdown, putting the hated People's Militia on alert. These militias, known as the Armed Fist of the Working Class, were state-sanctioned regiments of armed factory workers who wore their workers' garb so as to give the impression of spontaneous worker support for the Communist Party. Jakeš also put special units of the army trained to deal with public insurrection on standby, awaiting his signal to enter Prague and shut down the protests. But lacking clear support from Moscow, the Presidium couldn't bring itself to give the order to risk mass bloodshed in Wenceslas Square. In the meantime, the border garrisons were brought into the capital to maintain order, but no one had arranged accommodation for them. The troops spent the night shivering inside their buses parked outside the Interior Ministry. Students took pity on them and brought over hot soup, which was gratefully received. Tuesday, 21st November. Wenceslas Square had become a mass open-air auditorium, and Havel, the master dramatist, saw the need for a high central stage from which civic forum leaders could address the crowds. Through an old school contact, he was given access to a small balcony on the Melantric building, positioned midway up the square, which could be entered via a newspaper office. Havel's rock musician friends set up a powerful sound system that could reach the whole of Wenceslas Square, making every word intelligible. As Tuesday afternoon drew to a close, the square filled up to the brim again. People climbed into the trees and on top of phone booths and newspaper kiosks waving flags. Havel stepped onto the Melantric balcony and welcomed the cheering crowd with a rumbling, "Dear friends." He introduced the Civic Forum leadership one by one. And then a woman stepped forward on the balcony, breathing heavily and emotionally in the fading afternoon light. It was Marta Kubishova. The crowd hadn't seen Marta for 2 decades. Her otherworldly, youthful beauty had faded, but her presence now had a different power. The crowd saw her greying hair, her everyday clothes and glasses, and recognised her as one of them. Marta lifted up her arms and tried not to cry. A thunderous chant went up, "Long live Marta! Long live Marta!" And she thought, no singer ever had a comeback like this. The chanting faded into silence, and she began to sing a prayer for Marta. Her voice rang out, unaccompanied, clear and strong.
Ať mír dál zůstává s touto krajinou. Zloba, závist, zášť, strach a svár, ty ať pominou, ať už pominou.
Let peace remain within this land. Malice, envy, fear and strife, let them pass. Let them finally pass. Members of the crowd raised their hands to form a V sign for victory and for peace. That was the moment, Marta recalled, when people started to cry. International news crews wondered who this unknown woman was and why she had unlocked such a welter of emotions from the normally restrained Pragas. No one was more surprised than Marta's 10-year-old daughter, who had no idea her mother had once been a famous singer. Thursday, 23rd November. A prayer for Marta had given Pragas a badly needed emotional catharsis. There was a gentleness mixed into the sense of exaltation. Even those who had chosen to sit out the uprising and watch it on television felt themselves being coaxed out of their habitual reserve and public solitariness. Each day people felt stronger and stood up straighter, recalled one citizen. Eye contact between people was resumed and smiles were exchanged. Citizens performed small acts of generosity on public transport and in the cafes. Divisive party propaganda was drowned in the rising tide of goodwill. When Ruda Pravo denounced the student protesters as saboteurs and layabouts, the student leaders sent platoons of volunteers to keep the national monuments tidy and to clean up the public parks and gardens. Students donated blood and volunteered at hospitals and clinics. They sent emissaries to the giant CKD plant in Smykov to make the case for change to the workers, who passed a resolution condemning the police violence and calling for free elections. The students' courage and courtesy impressed their elders and shamed more than a few. How had a generation of young people raised in such a morally contaminated environment become so idealistic? It's a terrible dishonour, one worker said, when it is the children who have to strive for the reform of our society. Worker support for the regime was slipping away. Miroslav Stepan, the party boss in Prague, also came to the CKD plant to address the workforce. He attempted to ridicule the protest movement. 15-year-old kids cannot decide who the president will be, he snorted. A worker shot back, "We are not kids." An angry chant went up, "We are not kids, we are not kids." Stepan, shocked, tried to talk over the raucous jeers and whistles. "I will finish." "I don't think you understand," he said. "I wasn't talking about you." A new chant began. "Resign, resign, resign, resign." Stepan gaped wordlessly at the crowd, then turned away and went back inside. A bunker mentality set in among the party leadership. Havel, who was aware of the troops stationed around Prague, was worried that Jakeš might order a military massacre. He was deeply troubled when the army's chief of staff declared on state television that the armed forces were standing by, ready to defend the party and socialism. Havel decided to plant a seed of doubt in the party's mind that if they gave the order to shoot, their soldiers might not obey. That night in Wenceslas Square, Havel called for the army to side with the people and, if necessary, to defend them. Choosing his words carefully, he obliquely reminded the party of the international consequences of a massacre. "Not only our future is at stake," he said, "but all of Europe's." Friday, 24th November. Civic Forum's scope and reach expanded rapidly, with branches appearing in towns and cities across the country. In Bratislava, Slovaks formed their own opposition group, Public Against Violence, which coordinated their activities with their colleagues in Prague. In the space of a week, Civic Forum had grown from a dissident coalition into an alternative government. The group commandeered the Magic Lantern Theatre on Narodny Street and converted it into an improvised shadow parliament. Meetings and debates took place in the auditorium, while activists occupied a jumble of overheated foyers, dressing rooms, offices and storage spaces. The clammy air was filled with laughter and argument and the distinct fug of cigarette smoke, sweat, damp coats and revolution. On Friday afternoon, Havel was on stage at the Magic Lantern chairing a meeting when Alexander Dubček walked in. Dubček looked very much like his old self in his neat grey coat and hat, the uniform of the communist functionary. He moved more slowly and deliberately. There was still the same shy smile, the sad eyes and open face. At sunset, Havel brought Dubček to the Melanchthon building. Another capacity crowd had congregated outside in Wenceslas Square. Dubček stood back from the windows, waiting to be introduced, while Havel tried to give him tips on how to handle the crowd. "They'll scream, 'Dubček, Dubček,' and you'll have to calm them down," he said. "Thanks for your help," Dubček replied tersely, "but I know how to deal with that." Nothing, however, could prepare Dubček for the stadium-sized roar that greeted him as he stepped onto the balcony. The crowd could hardly believe what they were seeing. It was really Dubček, back after all these years. "Dubček, Dubček, Dubček." Dubček faffed around awkwardly, donned his thick-rimmed glasses, and pulled them off and grinned boyishly. Leaning right over the balcony, he opened his arms and brought them in, as if to hug every single person in the square, and the crowd went wild. Havel, with his aversion to showy public gestures, would never have done such a thing. The crowd took up a new chant. "Dubček to the castle." "That depends on you," he replied. Dubček, who was a far more popular and better-known leader than Havel, might have become the figurehead of the revolution at that moment. But his presence was received more enthusiastically than the speech he gave. Dubček hadn't moved on from 1968. He still wanted to redeem socialism with a human face, and his language was still laden with clapped-out Marxist jargon. Dubček had come back to Prague believing that the times had caught up with him at last, but instead they'd passed him by. Still, it had been a magical moment. When the spotlights were turned off, Dubček and Havel were seen backlit against the window, gently twirling around each other in a little pirouette of joy. Marek Toman, who had spent the week campaigning for the general strike, was still worried that people might end up settling for a more innocuous form of communism. He'd seen too much apathy over the years to be impressed by the newfound courage of his fellow citizens. How was it, he wondered, that all these people who were so docile for so long had become so bold? Dubček and Havel returned to the Magic Lantern Theatre that evening for the regular 7:30 p.m. media conference. Someone asked a question about socialism. Havel said that the word had become meaningless in Czechoslovakia. Dubček was debating the point when a bearded aide crept on stage, crouched down beside Havel, and whispered in his ear. Havel stood up and announced that the entire presidium had just resigned. The whole theatre leapt to its feet, weeping and cheering. Someone uncorked a champagne bottle, splashing the fizz all over the stage. Havel, revelling in the happy mayhem, hugged Dubček and then raised a toast to a free Czechoslovakia. Outside, car drivers heard the news on their radios and honked their horns. In the square, people cried and sang and danced, dizzy with joy and relief. 4 soldiers in uniform ran arm in arm together, laughing and waving flags. Incredibly, only a week had passed since the Student March. After decades in which accomplishing the smallest thing had been so hard and harrowing, everything was now coming to them so quickly. Now we have this fantastic speed. On the weekend, the public rallies moved to the spacious Letna Plain, near the plinth, where the megalithic statue of Stalin once stood. More than 600,000 people showed up on both days, as many as half the city's entire population. There were concurrent rallies in Bratislava, in Brno, Ostrava, and in other towns and cities across the nation. On Sunday morning, thousands of Catholics and interested onlookers walked up to St. Vitus Cathedral to attend a celebratory Mass for the canonisation of St. Agnes of Bohemia, the medieval princess who came down from the castle to live among the poor 7 centuries ago. An old prophecy which predicted that Bohemia would not prosper until Agnes was canonised was remembered. Later she would be named the patron saint of the overthrow of communism. Elsewhere that morning, a Civic Forum delegation met with Prime Minister Ladislav Adamec, an apparatchik presenting himself as a reasonable, liberal communist in the Gorbachev mould. Adamec had earlier dismissed Havel as a nobody and had refused to meet him. But once Adamec realised that help was not coming from Moscow, he agreed to sit down with the scruffy playwright, who was dressed informally in an open-necked shirt. "We haven't met yet, have we?" Adamets said, extending his hand across the table. "I'm Havel," said the playwright, stating the obvious. The meeting was brief. Adamets quickly agreed to release all political prisoners in Czechoslovakia's jails, including Ivan Yurus. Havel, in turn, invited Adamets to speak at that afternoon's rally on Letna Plain. Havel's intention was to build up Adamets's popularity and enhance his authority within the Presidium as a negotiating partner. But at Letna, Adamets's speech flopped. His announcement that the government was ready to accept all of Civic Forum's demands was well received, but when he proposed that the next day's general strike should be a symbolic act and last only 3 minutes, there were boos and whistles. Adamets walked off the stage to a cacophony of heckling and jeering. The dissident Catholic priest Václav Mali felt obliged to step in on his behalf. "As democratically thinking people, we must allow others to speak freely," he told the crowd, "even if we don't agree with them." That evening, at the Magic Lantern Theatre, a Civic Forums subcommittee presented a multi-point "What We Want" document to its members. It proposed a return to Mazaric's democratic republic, with rule of law, an independent judiciary, free elections, a market economy, social justice, a clean environment, a cultural and academic life free of the shackles of ideology, and a return to Europe. The document was read out to the auditorium by Václav Klaus, a silver-haired economist from the Academy of Sciences, who had studied at Cornell University in the United States. Klaus was a free marketeer and an admirer of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Havel was to become the figurehead of the new post-communist society, but Klaus would be the principal architect of its economy. "History has begun to develop very quickly in this country," Havel said. "In a country that has had 20 years of timelessness, now we have this fantastic speed."
This is the end of CD 14. The book continues on CD 15. CD 15.
Strike. On Tuesday morning, Praguers went to work as usual. But at noon, church bells rang out across the city and all labour abruptly ceased. Workers in factories downed tools and switched off machines. Shops, cafes, bookstores, pharmacies and offices closed their doors. Urban mass transit came to a halt. On television, a broadcaster announced he was joining the strike and would go off the air. And for the next 2 hours, state TV simply showed scenes of demonstrations from all over the country. Strikers marched from Narodny Street into Wenceslas Square, carrying flags, singing the national anthem. Prague's taxis formed a 2-mile-long blockade of the city's ring road. The 2-hour strike was a complete success. It had gathered the massive but slightly incoherent energies of the revolution and brought them all to a sharp point. Havel had declared that the strike would be a referendum on the regime, and now the results were in. Not one institution, the army, the People's Militia, the media, the unions, had come to the regime's defence. That same day, after an absence of 12 years, an excited Paul Wilson made his return to Prague. Paul had been in Berlin working on a radio documentary series called The Gorbachev Revolution when news of the Wenceslas Square demonstrations broke out. He drove at once to the Czech border, but he was still officially persona non grata and couldn't get in. Then a friend told him that exiles arriving at Prague airport were being waved through, so he booked a flight. Outside the airport, Paul found the Canadian ambassador waiting with a limousine, ready to take him directly to Civic Forum headquarters. When Paul entered the Magic Lantern, he saw Havel on stage with the other Forum leaders, delivering their nightly media conference. Paul ran into people he hadn't seen for more than a decade. The friends from his wild rock and roll youth had become middle-aged activists running a revolution. It was quite exciting, he said, to say the least. Normal all the time. In the week that followed, the central clauses of one-party rule were pulled out from the Constitution like rotten teeth. The National Assembly voted to abolish Article 4, which affirmed the leading role of the Communist Party, along with the clause that enshrined Marxism-Leninism as the official state ideology. The parliamentary debate on Article 4 was televised live, exposing the members as confused placeholders. Some were filmed snoozing in their chairs. On the 3rd of December, the party made its last stand, when Adamets put forward the long-awaited proposal for a new government. Civic Forum's leaders could only shake their heads in amazement. A few non-communists were to be appointed to minor posts, but 15 of the 20 ministries were to be retained by party members, including the crucial army and interior portfolios. Adamets's lack of influence within the party was vividly exposed, and it terminated his usefulness as a negotiating partner. Havel called for Adamets's resignation and for a demonstration in Wenceslas Square the next day. After weeks of protests and frenetic, sleepless activity, Civic Forum's energy was starting to flag. The student leaders were also exhausted and debating whether to continue their strike. Some complained of feeling sidelined by the self-appointed grown-ups of Civic Forum, who had commandeered the revolution they had started. But there was too much momentum now among the general public for the revolution to stall, and the next evening, Wenceslas Square was filled to capacity once again. It was still the best show in town. Civic Forum's Václav Mály demanded free elections by June 1990. Adamets was put on notice that he had 6 days to come up with a much better proposal, or the government would face another general strike. The rally ended on a high note when Karel Gott appeared on the Melanchthonic balcony to sing the national anthem alongside singer-songwriter Karel Kryl, who had returned from his 20-year exile in West Germany. "That's when we knew for sure it was a real revolution," said Katrin Bock. "Everybody thought, if Karel Gott is singing here, now, then we win." Adamets resigned the next day in favour of his deputy, Marian Chalfa, a communist technocrat who knew how to use elements of the existing system to manage the transition to democracy. "They knew who, and I knew how," is how he summed up his relationship with Civic Forum. Chalfa, in consultation with Havel, formed a temporary Government of National Understanding, allocating half the portfolios, including the Army and Interior Ministries, to non-communists. Jerzy Dienstbier, a dissident journalist, was named as Foreign Minister. Jan Czarnogórski, a Slovak lawyer only just released from prison, was to be Deputy Prime Minister with responsibility for the security services. Peter Miller, the CKD electrician, was now Minister for Labour and Social Affairs. The neoliberal economist Václav Klaus was to be Finance Minister. President Gustav Husak swore in the new government on the 10th of December at Prague Castle and then resigned. After the ceremony, Husak asked Czarnogórski how long he'd been in prison. 8 months, he replied. Husak laughed and said it was nothing compared to the 9 years he'd served back in the 1950s. In Husak's mind, somehow, they were both victims of communism. After 41 years, the Communist Party dictatorship was finished. A slogan appeared on walls and in shop windows that said, "They tried to normalise us, but we were normal all the time." Havel na Hrad. Husak's resignation brought the question of who should replace him into sharp focus. As the nation's head of state, the new president would be entrusted with the critical 6-month transition to democracy, with free elections scheduled for June 1990. The strong consensus among Civic Forum members was that only Havel had the leadership skills, the prestige, and the moral authority to carry the nation over the threshold. On the day of Husak's resignation, Civic Forum announced its nomination of Havel for the presidency to a cheering crowd in Wenceslas Square. Posters of the smiling playwright, accompanied by the slogan Havel na Hrad, Havel to the castle, appeared all over the city. Not everyone was certain that Havel would run for the presidency or run away from it. 2 years earlier, when he'd spotted Mikhail Gorbachev outside the National Theatre, Havel had felt some pity for the Soviet leader, who he assumed was yoked to the demands of high office. He wrote, "The whole day he sees the unappealing faces of his bodyguards. His schedule is busy with endless briefings, meetings and appearances. He must speak to a vast number of people, remember them all, and not confuse them one with another. He must keep saying things that are witty but correct, things that the world, which is ever hungry for sensation, cannot snatch and use against him." This passage, written only a year before the Velvet Revolution, was very likely the product of Havel wrestling with his own secret suspicion that he too might become a captive of high office before long. In October 1989, Havel had told a friend, "I'm a writer, not a politician. I would like to be a kingmaker, but not a king." But by December, Havel had overcome his misgivings and had decided not to shirk the challenge of power. In public, he was already acting like a president in waiting, making speeches, shaking hands with the general public, holding court with an entourage of assistants and bodyguards. He claimed to be a reluctant conscript. "I obviously don't want to be president," he told a Civic Forum meeting, "but if the situation sharpens in such a way that it would be in the interests of the country to have me as president for a short while, then I'm able to be president, since I have always subordinated my personal interests to the interests of the country. Otherwise, I would not have gone to prison." Havel's publicly expressed reservations were partly a political posture, far better to be pressed into high office than be seen to be hungering for it. But he did want the job. He accepted the necessity of it, and was now ready to push aside those who stood in his way. In the normal run of things, it would be the National Assembly that would appoint a new president. But the communists, playing for time, now called for a public vote instead, hoping to stall the revolutionary momentum. On the 15th of December, Havel, the leader of a movement dedicated to transparency and democracy, held a secret meeting with Prime Minister Chalfa to thwart the move for a popular vote. They met in the one government office Chalfa could find that wasn't bugged. Chalfa told Havel that communism was dead and buried, that he couldn't care less about the party, and that Havel should become president and usher in a proper democracy and a market economy as soon as possible. Chalfa offered to swing the moribund parliament behind Havel's candidacy. Havel reported this conversation to a closed meeting of the Civic Forum leadership. "The paradox of my situation," he said, "is that we are opponents of closed-door politics, and this has to be kept a total secret from our people and the public." Havel's determination to win the presidency became apparent in another secret meeting held the following day with Miroslav Pavel, the director of Czechoslovak television. Havel wanted airtime as a presidential candidate to improve his national profile. But the television executive bluntly told him he was just a minor political figure and only deserved a late-night slot. This high-handedness ignited an explosion of long-suppressed rage in Havel, who threatened to have Pavel sacked when he came to power. Pavel relented gracelessly, then left the room in a fury. Havel got his primetime slot and spoke to the nation that evening. In his speech, Václav Havel maintained the posture of the reluctant candidate. He declared he would accept the job as president under two conditions: that he would only serve as a transitional figure until a new president could be chosen by a freely elected National Assembly, and secondly, that Alexander Dubček, a Slovak, would serve by his side. "I will neither allow any dark powers to erect a barrier between him and me, nor between our two nations," he said. If Havel had overcome his misgivings over the presidency, his wife, Olga, had not. When Paul Wilson came to the Havels' apartment for a breakfast interview, he found the future First Lady of Czechoslovakia on her hands and knees, furiously scrubbing the bathroom floor. "Oh, why does Václav have to be president?" she moaned. "Why can't it be someone else?" Paul sat down with Havel to begin the interview, but then the phone rang. Dubček was on the line. Havel apologised and left the room to take the call, rolling his eyes. Dubček, the vanquished hero of 1968, wanted to be president at least as much as Havel did. He was still more popular and better known than the playwright. But Dubček had worn out his welcome among Civic Forum members, who were tired of his quest for vindication and uninterested in resuming an endless seminar on the viability of socialism with a human face. Havel held 5 emotional meetings with Dubček to persuade him to relinquish his claim to the presidency. Dubček was by turns angry and tearful. In the end, they struck a deal. In return for Dubček's support, Havel would serve only as a transitional president, and at the end of his 6 months, he would step aside for the older man. In the interim, Dubček would be awarded with the second most prestigious position in the nation, Chairman of the National Assembly. But it was a hollow understanding. The gift of the presidency was not Havel's to bestow, and he would never deliver on it anyway. President Havel. On the 29th December 1989, the members of the National Assembly convened at Prague Castle's medieval Vladislav Hall. The hall, crowned with its lovely star-vaulted ceiling, had been built large enough to host indoor jousting tournaments between armoured knights on horseback. Václav Havel watched the formal proceedings on television from an adjacent room as the National Assembly members unanimously elected him president. He was then brought into the hall by Dubček in his role as chairman of the National Assembly. For once, Havel was immaculately groomed, with a trim haircut and in a tailored suit. His face was a sombre mask. Havel walked slowly to the rostrum, sat down and signed his oath of office. Outside, the heaving crowd in Hradčany Square erupted into ecstatic cheers. After the ceremony, Havel, Olga and their friends were admitted to the presidential palace. As they walked through the citadel of their vanquished enemies, Havel, who would never again be so exalted, said he felt strangely paralysed, deflated, spent, lacking in imagination. Suddenly, he said, he had no idea what he was supposed to be doing. The revolutionaries introduced themselves to the staff and settled into their gloomy new offices. Some thought the castle still stank of the old regime. As they explored the rooms, they found hidden wires and microphones, and the closet with the hotline to Moscow. One assistant opened another door to discover a room full of people with headsets, still monitoring the palace's phone calls, all in the name of state security. On New Year's Day, a nervous President Havel sat down before the cameras to deliver the traditional presidential address on national television. He managed a shy smile before donning his glasses and delivering an extraordinary speech, which confronted starkly and honestly the hard challenges that lay ahead. Havel spoke of the moribund economy, the ravaged environment, and the absence of social justice. But the most serious problem, he said, was the lingering moral contamination in their society, the ingrained habit of saying one thing and thinking another. Fortunately, he said more brightly, the rising generation had given them something to lean on. Where did the young people, who never knew another system, get their desire for truth, their love of free thought, their political ideas, their civic courage and civic prudence? How did it happen that their parents, the very generation that had been considered lost, joined them? How is it that so many people immediately knew what to do and none needed any advice or instruction? We are a small country, he said optimistically, yet at one time we were the spiritual crossroads of Europe. Is there a reason why we could not again become one? The President concluded his speech with a flourish, a phrase that echoed the words of John Amos Comenius, Tomasz Masaryk, and Marta Kupishova. People, your government has returned to you. Chapter 12. Together Alone. April 1991. 16 months after the Velvet Revolution, Kim and I are in Melbourne, having breakfast in the ground floor restaurant of a luxurious hotel, when two powerfully built men in suits and ties enter the room, followed by a slightly stooped older man with combed back silver hair and a familiar beak-like nose. Kim asks me what I'm staring at. "That guy there," I say, pointing with my fork. "That's Alexander Dubček." "What?" "No," she says, disbelieving. Across the room, the chairman of the Czechoslovak National Assembly slowly lowers himself into a chair at a corner table, while his associates fetch his buffet breakfast. Dubček's appearance strikes me as absurdly meaningful. I'd been wandering through distorted versions of Prague in my dreams of late, and now it's as though Dubček has casually stepped from them into the waking world. Idiotically, I borrow a pen and paper from a waiter and gingerly approach Dubček for an autograph. He signs the paper and hands it back with a faint smile, and then I leave him to eat his breakfast in peace. He seems disconcertingly gloomy. I had expected him to carry himself with the glad confidence of a man vindicated by history. His natural buoyancy may well have been dampened by the long flight to Australia. Dubček, I later discovered, had come to Melbourne to receive a Human Rights Award, But at the time, the encounter seemed as improbable as running into Henry Kissinger in an Icelandic fjord. When I saw him that morning, he had just a year and a half left to live. On the 1st of September 1992, his chauffeur-driven BMW skidded off the road between Prague and Brno and plunged into a ravine. Dubček, who was not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown from the car, and he died months later of his injuries. He was 70 years old. The perfect formula for human happiness. In his memoir, Václav Havel likened his journey from prison to Prague Castle to the Czech fairy tale of little Honza. Although everyone tells him it's hopeless, little Honza keeps beating his head against a wall until it collapses and he becomes king. But Havel was well aware it was in the gift of no political leader to write the next sentence, that everyone should live happily ever after. He knew the wave of joy that had carried him into Prague Castle would place unrealistic expectations on him as president. "We are coming in as heroes," he warned his staff, "but in the end, when they realise what a mess we're in and how little we can do about it, they will railroad us, tarred and feathered, out of town." Havel, as he feared, became a captive of high office and of his status as a global celebrity. His staff of enthusiastic amateurs were too inexperienced to manage his schedule properly or to help shoulder his burdens, allowing his valuable time to be taken up with too many meetings and interviews. Havel rebelled against the need to bring the public around to change by repeating the same stock phrases again and again. He worked long hours, was often ill, and sat through state banquets in foreign capitals dying for a cigarette. The impressive political skills that Havel had displayed as leader of Civic Forum seemed to desert him as president. He was unwilling to accept the necessity of contesting political parties in a parliamentary democracy. On his first state visit to Germany, he reportedly joked to Chancellor Helmut Kohl, "Why don't we work together to dissolve all political parties? Why don't we set up just one big party, the Party of Europe?" Civic Forum split anyway, with Václav Klaus forming a centre-right Civic Democratic Party, which won the 1992 elections. Without a party to stand behind him, Havel lacked the parliamentary strength to prevent the breakup of Czechoslovakia, the most serious failure of his presidency. The Union had splintered once before under assault from Adolf Hitler. This time the split was achieved by a simple parliamentary vote, despite polls indicating majority support for the Union in both nations. Havel, still the most admired figure in the country, backed by a solid majority of his fellow citizens, was unable to stop it. The passion of the nationalist minorities prevailed over the half-hearted unionist majority, and Czechoslovakia split into separate Czech and Slovak nations on the 1st of January 1993. Today, more than 2 decades after the split, there are few regrets in either nation. The relationship had always been defined as much by external pressures as by their affinities. The Czechs and Slovaks were like a couple who eloped in 1918 to escape their overbearing families, the Austrians and the Hungarians. When the Cold War ended, they were free to part on reasonably good terms. For Havel, the acquiescence to a velvet divorce with Slovakia was a classic triumph of Czech small-mindedness, a retreat into bitter provincialism. At the end of the 20th century, after 1,000 years of coexistence, the Jews and the Germans were gone, and now the Czechs had parted ways with the Slovaks. "And who will be left?" Havel asked. "Pure-blooded little Czechs in their own little garden." Like Tomáš Masaryk before him, President Havel was willing to draw on his immense popularity to say unpopular things to his people. He knowingly stirred controversy by suggesting it was time the nation apologised for the post-war expulsion of the Sudeten Germans, an act he described in a letter to the President of Germany as deeply immoral. The need for an apology was contested by Ivan Klima, who was 14 when he was released from Terezin concentration camp. "It is true," he wrote, "the behaviour of some Czechs after the war was unacceptable, but too many of the Sudeten Germans had chosen the Nazis in 1938, and there had been so much killing and cruelty all round." Havel worked hard, nonetheless, to set relations between Germany and Czechoslovakia on a better footing. Putting issues of war-related compensation to one side, both nations signed a friendship treaty at Prague Castle in 1992. The ceremony was both joyful and sombre. "We have stood over too many graves in this century," the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl said. "We have shed too many tears. The time has come for us to learn from history." When the split with the Slovaks became inevitable, Havel resigned from the soon-to-be extinct Czechoslovak presidency. Paul Wilson advised him to retire from politics and become an outspoken writer again, but Havel felt he was still needed to provide a moral centre for a disoriented people struggling to find a way out of the post-communist morass. Havel chose to return to the political stage, but, as Paul Wilson noted at the time, the playwright had become the protagonist in a different kind of drama. The Velvet Revolution in 1989 was like a morality play, Paul said. The good guys and bad guys were clear. Havel was the knight on the white charger. He could do no wrong. But the situation he's in now is like one of his own plays. That's the irony of it. A play in which the hero is a deeply troubled person in a morally ambiguous situation, who doesn't really know what to do, who is put upon by people from all sides, who's constantly being importuned for help and advice, and who does not really know the right way out. In February 1993, the governing coalition nominated Havel to become the first president of the newly minted Czech Republic. But under its constitution, Havel's power was more tightly constrained, and he reigned rather than ruled as president. Unlike Tomáš Masaryk, who exercised immense informal power at Prague Castle, Havel held office as a more conventional, largely ceremonial head of state. Havel and his Prime Minister, Václav Klaus, could barely conceal their dislike for each other. Havel was polite. Klaus was blunt. Havel believed in acting in concert with Europe and the world to address climate change. Klaus denounced the European Union and thought climate change was a leftist hoax. Klaus was a doctrinaire free marketer. Havel thought all ideologies were reductive, and that to bow before them was to betray one's own better judgment. Havel was obliged to preside over Klaus's shock therapy privatisation scheme for state-owned enterprises through a controversial voucher scheme. Property confiscated by the state in 1948 was sold or returned to the original owners, with billions of dollars changing hands. The process was accompanied by numerous well-reported instances of corruption and fraud. Havel spoke of an ugly mood in the country. He said, "Many are convinced that honest people fare badly while fraudulent nouveau riche get the green light." The Czech Communist Party retained a degree of support in the industrial regions hardest hit by the open economy, and among elderly voters nostalgic for an era when jobs were secure and not particularly onerous. Havel saw this as the dilemma of the prisoner who does not know how to cope with freedom. In prison, he said, everything is laid out for you. You don't have to decide on anything. They tell you when to get up, what to wear. Everything's decided for you by others. If you live in this for years and are then suddenly released, freedom becomes a burden. Prague, meanwhile, was buoyed by an influx of income from the masses of foreign visitors attracted by the city's picturesque qualities and its cheap beer. Prague's dilapidated historic buildings were repainted and repaired. Prague's body was healed, but she lost a little bit of her soul in the process. In the 2 decades between 2000 and 2019, annual visitor numbers jumped from 2.6 million to just under 8 million. Excessive tourism has driven local residents from the city centre, eroding its livability and sociability. Here and there you notice a few unmarked hidden pubs in Mala Strana, maintained so that Praguers can enjoy each other's company, safe from the throngs of foreign pub crawlers. Vratislav Brabenec, the Plastic People of the Universe's saxophonist, throws up his hands at the latest foreign invasion. Once it was Russian soldiers, he complains. Now it is tourists. I can't decide which is worse. Lustration. The STB was officially dissolved on the 1st of February 1990, and citizens were given access to their personal files. The lists of names of those who had collaborated with the secret police made for sad reading. There were brothers who had informed on sisters, wives against their husbands. Informers were found in the ranks of former Charter 77 activists. Jan Urban, who discovered that some of his best friends had been STB informers, received the news more in sorrow than in anger. I found out how state security broke them down, he said. I don't want to judge. I don't know how I would have behaved in their shoes. On the 4th of October 1991, the National Assembly passed lustration laws, taken from the word lustratsa, a word that bundles together the concept of bringing to light with purification. The laws were designed to purify the civil service by naming and shaming government employees with links to the secret police. Havel signed the act, but immediately sought to amend it, without success. He was torn between the need to keep the cynical opportunists of the old regime from getting their hooks into the new republic, and the desire to avoid a poisonous, divisive witch hunt. He admitted, "We have not yet found a dignified and civilised way to reckon with our past." The question of how to proceed against those who had enthusiastically participated in torture and judicial murder was less morally fraught, but just as difficult. In 2007, a Czech court found 86-year-old Ludmila Brožova-Polednova guilty of being an accomplice to murder. Brožova-Polednova had acted as a workers' prosecutor at the trial of Milada Horakova in 1950 and had been one of the loudest voices demanding the death penalty in the courtroom. At Milada Horakova's execution, Brožova-Polednova was heard to shout, "Don't break her neck on the noose, suffocate the bitch." She was sentenced to serve 6 years at a special geriatric prison facility, but was pardoned after a year and died 5 years later. Other criminal accomplices of the old regime escaped justice entirely. In February 2019, Marek Toman brought me along to the screening of a documentary called The Case of Uherskie Radistje, and to meet the filmmaker, Kristina Vlachova. Marek has known Kristina since the late 1980s, when he was an undergraduate and she was the receptionist at a student dormitory. Kristina had spent a decade making the documentary, an investigation into a notorious secret police prison where political prisoners were routinely tortured throughout the 1950s. Her camera followed the survivors as they wandered through the derelict building, revisiting its former torture chambers. Some of them had never found out why they had been brought there in the first place. Christina's film also followed the Czech justice system's half-hearted attempt to bring one of the worst of the STB torturers, Alois Grebenecek, to trial in the 1990s. Grebenecek's lawyer presented the court with a series of medical certificates stating he was too ill to attend. But Christina's film showed him energetically haranguing a camera crew outside his house. The trial dragged on for years, and Grebenecek died without ever having stepped into the courtroom. The judge, who had a communist background, came under fire from critics who questioned the ability of the Czech judicial system to deal with the crimes of the Stalinist era. Christina's dark and unflinching film left me breathless. I asked if I could meet with her and Marek later that week at the Café Slavia. We took up a corner table in the near-empty restaurant section, and she told me her story. Christina was born in 1943 under a different name, Jana Slanska. Slanska is the feminine form of Slansky, name that her family shared with Rudolf Slansky, the Communist Party General Secretary. There was no family connection, but after the 1948 communist takeover, the name alone could strike fear into a room full of strangers. Christina remembers waiting to see the dentist as a child when the nurse called out, "Jana Slanska," and she saw the other patients stiffen in fear. When Rudolf Slansky was arrested and executed as a traitor, her name drew even more unwelcome attention. After she left school, she published some poetry under a nom de plume and decided to keep using it. Christina studied screenwriting under Milan Kundera at Prague's film school, FAMU, and she fell in love with Joseph Kudelka, the photographer who shot some of the most dramatic images of the Soviet invasion in 1968 while standing on top of a tank. Kudelka's photos were smuggled out of Prague and published in London's Sunday Times, making him internationally famous. He left Prague to take up a job in France, but Christina decided to remain. In 1969, Christina befriended Václav and Olga Havel, who came to see a play she'd written that year that was shut down by the state after just 2 performances. In 1977, when the Communist Party asked her to put her name to its anti-charter document, she refused. This was career suicide, but she knew that signing it would defame an honest man and betray a friend. After that, all her film work dried up, and she was dismissed from her job at a children's publishing house. Former colleagues shunned her. "I would run into them on the stairs in the subway," she says, "and they would give me a look as if to say, 'You stupid person.'" Christina took on the job at the university as a dormitory receptionist, where she organised unofficial film seminars for students and passed the days wondering if she'd ever make a film again. The Velvet Revolution liberated her. Now in her late 40s, she was anxious to make up for lost time. She created more than a dozen features investigating the crimes of Nazism and communism. While making the Grebenecek documentary, she was called at home by several people who refused to name themselves, telling her to drop the matter and not make trouble for other people. After she mentioned in a radio interview that she was taping these calls, they abruptly stopped. "It's still present here today," she told me, "the spectre of communism." President Havel's popularity inevitably began to wane as the national mood soured. In January 1996, Olga, his wife of 32 years, died of cancer. Olga had been a much-loved figure among the Czech people, and when Havel married young actress Dagmar Veskanova less than a year later, it went over poorly. Dagmar was perceived as demanding and imperious, and her husband, the moralistic president, was jeered in the tabloid media as an old man besotted by a pushy younger woman. As someone who'd spent his life railing against utopian thinking, Havel was irritated by complaints that he'd promised to bring universal justice and happiness to his people. In a speech accepting an honorary doctorate, he said, "Many Czechs are angry with me because love and truth haven't yet prevailed over lies and hatred, and they hold me responsible. Those who complain that the promise remains unfulfilled have turned this ideal into an illusion. No one will provide the perfect formula for human happiness, and no one can. But there are lights to show us the way." Havel's presidency, for all its failures and missed opportunities, must be regarded as a success. The nation became safer, freer, and more prosperous during his years in office. As head of state, he embedded and normalised democratic habits. As the nation's figurehead, he used his immense prestige to elevate his country's standing in the world and to encourage his citizens to rise above small-minded self-interest. At the unveiling of a monument to Tomáš Masaryk, Havel quoted his predecessor's words, "We had been buried when we ceased to live the larger life." Masaryk's phrase had been weirdly prescient. The statues of the founder-president that had sprung up after his death in 1937 had to be buried for safekeeping 2 years later when the Nazis invaded. After the Allied victory in 1945, the statues were pulled up and reinstalled, but had to be buried again after the communist takeover. The zombie Masaryks rose briefly from their graves once more during the Prague Spring to enjoy a few brief months in the sun until the Soviet invasion sent them back underground. Prague is still wrestling with its communist monuments. The presence of a heroic statue of Soviet Field Marshal Ivan Konev, erected in 1980, was deeply resented in Prague. The marshal, who led the Red Army into the city at the end of the war, had also been complicit in the 1968 Soviet invasion. Protesters splashed pink paint on the statue. After repeated attacks, the local mayor, Andrei Kolář, complained that he was tired of polishing the marshal's boots and had the statue surrounded by a tarpaulin so his council would no longer incur the cost of removing the paint and graffiti. Russian diplomats objected and implied that the mayor was a closet Nazi. When the statue was taken down, Kolář went into hiding after receiving numerous death threats, allegedly originating in Russia. The Soviet Tank Memorial in Kinsky Square, which was previously known as Soviet Tank Crew Square, was another unwelcome monument. Like the Marian Column, it had come to signify subjugation by a foreign imperial power. In 1991, the Czech artist David Černý and a group of friends solved the problem by painting the Soviet tank entirely pink. Černý was briefly arrested for hooliganism, and the tank was repainted green. But then 15 newly elected Civic Forum parliamentarians came out to paint the monster pink again. The tank's status as a national monument was revoked, and the council moved it to Lešany, 30 kilometres south of the city. In 2011, a replica of the pink tank, with a gigantic, erect middle finger sticking out of the turret, was placed on a barge and sailed down the Vltava to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the withdrawal of Soviet troops. Václav Havel left the presidency in 2003. In retirement, he wrote his final play called Leaving, which told the story of a former statesman who was stripped of the accoutrements of power and must come to terms with being defined by his years in office. Leaving was well received by audiences and critics. Havel, despite his poor health, was able to direct the film adaptation. After decades of chain smoking, Havel became increasingly ill with respiratory issues. There was a chain of hospitalisations and near-death experiences before he died in 2011. The people of faraway Tbilisi in Georgia have erected a statue to Václav Havel, but at the time of writing, none exist in Prague. Prague's airport has been named for the playwright-president, as well as a small open space next to the new building of the National Theatre, even though Havel hated the glass and concrete edifice. The Václav Havel Library has found a modest home on Ostrovny Street in the new town. The library feels warm and welcoming, and it honours the memory, better than any grandiose statue could, of one of the largest human beings of his time. Prague now has a permanent memorial to the sacrifice of Jan Palach and his fellow Human Torch, Jan Zajíc. At the top of Wenceslas Square, in the place where Palach lit his match, a contorted cross is embedded in the paving stones. It twists gently and rises up at the head, implying some kind of resurrection, or the need for one. 16th of January 2019. I step off the tram on Voditskova Street and join the tide of people flowing into Wenceslas Square. Television cameras are present to broadcast the event, a commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Jan Palach's self-immolation. A video screen displays one of his final statements. People must fight against the evil they feel equal to at that moment. Tonight's ceremony is as much about the present as it is about the past. The event has been put together by a group called 1 Million Moments for Democracy, an organisation of citizens alarmed by the assault on the integrity of their hard-won democratic institutions by unscrupulous politicians and oligarchs. Neither the Republic's president, Miloš Zeman, nor its Prime Minister, Andrej Babiš, is here. Zeman, a crude anti-Muslim demagogue, is strongly supportive of Russian foreign policy and has joked with Vladimir Putin about liquidating journalists. His vocal support for Russia and China inspired a group of guerrilla art activists to enter the presidential palace disguised as chimney sweeps. The protesters climbed onto the palace roof and hoisted a gigantic pair of red underpants on the presidential flagpole. The group later released a statement saying, "Today we hung a banner over the castle for a man who is not ashamed of anything." Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, a far more powerful figure, is a billionaire who controls a large segment of the Czech media. Babiš entered politics promoting himself as a businessman and a political cleanskin. But archival documents indicate that in 1980, Babiš was recruited by the STB as an informant. After 2 years' service, he was promoted to agent status and given the codename Bureš. Andrej Babiš insisted he'd been wrongly identified in the documents, but a court in Bratislava dismissed his claim. Support for the nationalist and populist parties is stronger in the regions than in Prague. Here, as in so many other places, a struggle for the nation's soul is waged between the cosmopolitan metropolis and the disgruntled hinterland. Authoritarianism is resurgent across Central and Eastern Europe. Neighbouring Hungary and Poland have repudiated the democratic gains of 1989 and are now governed by conspiracy-minded majoritarian regimes, unhindered by their cowed news organisations or a compliant judiciary. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán of Hungary once a liberal hero of 1989, is openly contemptuous of Western liberal democracy. Paul Wilson remains optimistic that the Czechs will stick with liberal democracy. He said, "I think Czech society is quite strong in ways that it doesn't realise itself. The Czechs are a very convivial people. They're natural organisers. At a time when it was basically illegal to create organisations that weren't run or monitored by the Communist Party, there were all kinds of invisible groupings. They're very good at organising on that level. This was something that Havel always tried to encourage. I think he was actually successful at that." Wenceslas Square is now filled to capacity. The crowd is mostly in their 20s and 30s. The man next to me hoists his daughter onto his shoulders, and she taps her small hands on his head in time with the music. On stage, a succession of writers and musicians take turns making speeches and singing songs. Dana Nemtsova, a Charter 77 activist, is helped to the stage. Thin taper candles are passed around, and soon the square is dotted with thousands of tiny points of light. At 7:30 p.m, the crowd forms a procession that flows down the ancient streets into the old town square and gathers around the statue of Jan Hus. The grand monuments on the square's periphery, the old town hall and its astronomical clock, the teen church, the tall Baroque houses, look down on us like a circle of giants observing the scene from the back rows. The speeches conclude and the crowd sings, "Where is my home?" It sounds sweet, sad, and fearful in the night air. Where is my home? Where is my home? Water roars across the meadows. Pine woods rustle among the crags. Acknowledgements. Firstly, I would like to thank Prague City of Literature for generously granting me a 2-month stay in 2019, and to Radka Eismanova and Katarzyna Bajo from the Municipal Library of Prague for their very kind assistance and for organising a wonderful author event at the Museum of Czech Literature. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to David Vaughan, journalist, broadcaster, academic, long-standing Prague resident, and the author of Battle of the Airwaves, who provided excellent editorial advice on the manuscript. David has a sophisticated and compendious knowledge of his adopted city, and his journalism with Radio Prague has contributed enormously to international understanding of Czech history. He was a kind and generous host throughout my 2-month stay. It was David who introduced me to Marek Toman, author, diplomat, translator, pirate actor, and Prince of Vinohrady. I cannot thank Marek enough for his friendship and for introducing me to so much of the history and cultural life of his city. "Tell me," Marek asked me on our first meeting, "do you know a Czech person in Australia named Jaroslav Kovaříček?" And as it happened, I did know Jaroslav. His name was one of the first that came to mind when I set myself the task of writing this book. And I owe Jaroslav a huge debt of gratitude for his insights into Bohemian history, literature, and music. A chance conversation with Canadian historian Gwyn Dyer put me in touch with Paul Wilson, former plastic person of the universe and translator of Havel, Hrabal, and Svoretsky. I had expected that writing about the normalisation era would be a gloomy business, but Paul Wilson helped me to see the passionate, beating heart beneath its apparently lifeless exterior, and as a result, I enjoyed writing that chapter most of all. I am filled with gratitude and admiration for Kristina Vlachova, both as a filmmaker and as an individual who was able to hold fast to truth and friendship in a bad time. My warm thanks also to Josephine Olivieri, who was able to recall so many subtle and telling details of post-revolutionary Prague. I am so very glad she was there to bear witness to it all, and that she had the presence of mind to take photos while we were there. I am grateful to Katrine Bock for her vivid account of the 17th of November student demonstration, to Anna O'Grady for her stories of growing up under communism, to the brilliant science historian Robin Arianrod, the author of Einstein's Heroes and Thomas Harriot, A Life in Science, who gave me editorial advice on the cavalcade of scientific geniuses that have passed through Prague over the centuries, to historian Paul Ham for his companionship over several days in the city, to Catbird Press for the kind permission to quote the poetry of Jaroslav Seifert, translated by Ewald Oses, to the ghost of the late Slovak author Ladislav Monachko for allowing me to write undisturbed in his apartment for 2 months, to the cafes Slavia, Liberal, Louvre and Ideal for their coffee, soup and beer, and a tip of the hat to Richard Flanagan, engineer of human souls and friend of the carnivorous spotted quoll, for his timely advice. I'm so thankful, as always, to the utterly magnificent Brigitte Doyle and Lachlan McLean at HarperCollins, and to Nathan Burton and Mark Campbell for the beautiful cover design, which so elegantly incorporates the Czech, German and Jewish elements of the city. Mary Rennie, my editor, was wonderful. Her enthusiasm, insight and precision lifted the text and helped me weed the overgrown garden of my first draft. I must also thank Kauri Gislason and Elizabeth Troyer for their support and advice, and Marcus Longfoot, the producer of this audiobook. And finally, all my love and thanks to my wife Kim, who brought her prodigious skills as a librarian and researcher to this book. I cunningly beguiled her into this project by casually dangling the story of the Winter Queen and King in front of her. Kim's penetrating and sympathetic grasp of human nature and her wise assessments of the great and not so great figures of history were invaluable to me.
Belinda hopes you enjoyed the reading of
The Golden Maze by Richard Feidler.
Our audiobooks are becoming increasingly popular among travellers, families, and people who are on the go. If you really enjoyed this audiobook, please introduce your friends and family to the experience. We're sure they'll love you for it. If you want to hear more about our fabulous range of titles, please visit us online at belinda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to always take a Belinda audiobook with you.